The Supreme Court comes to the aid of video games. Commodore's VIC-20 drops below $100. And Electronic Arts ships its first games. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we travel back in time to find out what was making headlines in the home computer and video game industries of yesteryear. Today we're turning back the clock 40 years to find out what was happening in May of 1983. I'm your host, Carl, and I'm joined by everybody's favorite co-host, Alex. Welcome back, Alex.
Hey, great to be back after taking a month off here.
Hey, everybody needs a break from time to time. But, yeah, Dale was here holding down the fort on our 40-year jump, and he did a good job.
I'm sure.
Yeah, bringing his VIC-20 experience to bear and failing miserably at Choplifter. So.
Excellent.
So, obligatory podcast banter. We'll keep this one short because we got a hell of a lot to cover today. What have you been up to?
Well, of course, just keeping on with my usual work, like my own podcast. Otherwise, yeah, got married. Did we mention that last time? Probably not. No, got married.
You didn't.
Yeah.
You didn't even tell me that you got married. Congratulations.
That's a big going on, sure. So, yeah.
Tell me, give us some deets. Big party, simple civil.
Yeah, simple civil. This was the second for both of us. So we'd both done the whole traditional wedding things in our younger years. So we're in the Atlanta area, so we just went down to the old Fulton County Courthouse and had them do it. It was a nice ceremony, though. They have a little chapel room specifically dedicated to doing the ceremonies that they decorate a little bit. And, it's a nice little ceremony. They go above and beyond the typical courthouse, I think it's fair to say. And they let you have people there, which is nice, too. So we were able to have a few family and friends, a small number, be there. And we brought a photographer. So it was a good experience.
Cool. Well, congratulations. Finally making an honest woman of this lady once again.
Absolutely.
No, dude, I'm very, very happy. My wife and I, we got married, just a small little thing. Both of our parents, maid of honor and best man, and that was it. And yeah, that's all you need, let's face it.
Absolutely.
Now, granted, we did have a big party afterwards, but we had that months and months later because we had to organize it. But that was, yeah. Oh, that party was good. Yeah.
After all, as people with law degrees, I can't call us both lawyers because I can't really fairly call myself one. But as people with law degrees, we both know it's not about the ceremony. It's about the new tax status.
No, that's as if we were accountants. As lawyers, we know we're not getting out of this without going to court.
Well, yes, that's
what
true
we
too.
know as lawyers.
That's true too. It's about the legally binding contract.
That's all marriage is at the end of the day. Don't ever, dear listeners, let someone else tell you that it's something more, emotions and all that nonsense. No, it's about a legally binding contract, and we're going to be talking about some legally binding contracts today. So, with that wonderful
look
segue,
at that transition.
Okay, everybody. Before we can turn on the time machine and head back to May of 1983, we first need to go to our first segment, the 7 Minutes in Heaven, where our intrepid co-host must play a game that was reviewed in a publication dated May 1983. And always remember, every time we talk about this being May 1983, we're always using cover dates of magazines and newspapers. So yes, obviously the news happened at some time before that. It's just a framing device. Don't send me emails. And if you did want to send me an email, because I always am glad to hear from any of our listeners, you can do that at videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com, the most easy to remember and short email address there ever was. Also, all the links to our social media, blah, 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 is all in the show notes, as well as links to all of the sources of everything we're going to be talking about. And most importantly, if you want to watch the video version of the 7 Minutes in Heaven, you can become a Patreon patron for just $1 a month and get a plethora of older videos, as well as early access to our interview episodes. So, of all the interesting titles, we had the Activision classic Keystone Capers, we had Congo Bongo from Sega in the arcades, we had Zaxxon coming to the 2600, an experience in and of to itself. One of my all-time favorite arcade games of this era, Zookeeper. But, let's face it, Return of the Jedi is coming soon to theaters near you. So there's only one game that it really could be, and that was Parker Brothers' Jedi Arena.
I had to go back to complete my training. I made a promise to an old friend.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how that works out for you. So, are you ready?
Ready as we're going to be.
Excellent.
You are entering a battlefield of the future. The Star Wars Jedi Arena.
Becoming a Jedi Master takes practice. Using your lightsaber, try to penetrate your opponent's defenses. But watch out, the whirling seeker can attack on its own. So follow your instincts. Now you're ready to take on any challenger who dares to oppose you.
Play the Jedi Arena home video game, alone or head-to-head. The challenge awaits you. From Parker Brothers, the ones to beat.
Welcome back, Alex, from your 7 Minutes in Heaven. So, for the uninitiated, how would you describe Jedi Arena based off of your 7 minutes with the game?
Absolutely. Well, Jedi Arena is basically Warlords, except that instead of 4 players, it's only 2 players, and instead of hurling fireballs at each other, you're kind of shooting beams at your opponent while blocking the beams coming from your opponent. But it's the same kind of idea that you have to break down a defense and then hit the other person to score a point. So,
very cool. Now, obviously, we're dealing with a 2600 game, so there are going to be certain compromises in the graphical fidelity. Mm-hmm. So, would you describe the graphics as truly representative of the swishing back and forth of the laser swords that you know and love from the Star Wars franchise?
Yeah, they do the absolute best they can. I mean, they capture them as well as they can with the graphics. I mean, they do have separate red and blue lightsabers for the 2 participants, which is not always an easy feat to have sprites of different colors present at the same time. So, you know, they keep them on opposite sides of the screen, of course, which is what makes it possible. But that's still pretty impressive of them. And you know, the remote from Episode 4 that is shooting the lasers, you know, it's just a circle. It's just a blob. So, I mean, that works fine because it's not like there's much to it anyway. So I think they did... You know, they approached it the best way they could with the technology they had. They clearly wanted to do something with Jedi because many Star Wars games before had already done all the various shooty sequences.
And to be fair, there's only been one Star Wars game so far at this point.
Yes.
The arcade game hasn't happened. All we've had is Empire.
Empire Strikes Back. Yep. But there have been other games that basically simulated the trench run, like Starhawk or whatever it is from Cinematronics.
That's true.
I mean,
come on. We're not dealing with pirated, illegally, unlicensed whatnot here.
That's right.
Those were all completely original ideas that had nothing to do with anything. That's why all the ships had, big wings.
Right.
On the sides,
Starfire, which most certainly did not have TIE fighters. But there'd been a lot of space shooters, so I think they probably wanted to get away from doing space shooters. And of course, they couldn't do Hoth because they'd already done it. And so it makes sense that they wanted to do something with Jedi. And I think this was probably the best approach to doing something with Jedi, because you couldn't have Jedi like duking it out in an epic sword fight, not on your humble little 2600. So I can see that, and, Warlords was a great VCS game, so doing something that kind of emulates that makes sense. The controls are a little weird on it. Now, I do have to stress, of course, I've never played this game before. That's kind of the point of the exercise. And I do want to stress that I was emulating it, so I was not using the paddle controllers. It could be that with a real paddle controller, some of this made a little more sense, but you both move your saber to block with the paddle and aim the remote to shoot with the paddle, and then use the fire button on the paddle to actually take your shot. But the shot is in the same direction that you are turning your paddle, which means that if your saber is in a position to block a shot that's coming at you, you're not going to be able to shoot your opponent from that same saber position. You actually have to move your saber the other way and expose yourself on that side to be able to aim the laser from the remote to hit your opponent. I don't know if that's an emulation thing or if that's working as intended, but that was a little strange, and I was a little unhappy about that. It seems to me that they could have defined the way the laser shoots however they want, so why not have those things work in tandem? Like if your saber's all the way over here, then the remote is shooting in the opposite direction that you're turning the paddle for your saber. I mean, it feels like if that is working as intended and not just a fault of emulating it, that could have been fixable in the programming so you didn't have that disconnect. But I mean, what do I know? I mean, I'm not a programmer.
I mean, I guess on one level it makes sense because you have to enter that compromise. It's about, okay, you're about to open yourself up. Do you think you have a good enough shot? Otherwise, quickly swing the sword back the other way to prevent the other guy from hitting you. But
that's fair.
Yeah.
There is a trade-off there, and that's fair. They may have decided they needed that trade-off to stop it from being too easy to block the shots. And I accept that.
Yeah. But okay, would you recommend this game to another player?
I would. I thought it was a very interesting concept, and of course I was just playing it one player against a computer opponent. It's a two-player game, and I can see how as a multiplayer game it could probably be a pretty strong game for the time period. I mean, in today's modern age, are you going to get hours and hours of enjoyment out of it? No, there are better multiplayer games you can spend your time on, of course. But I think it's worth fiddling around with a little bit, and I was definitely getting into it by the end. I was trying to pull out a last point before my 7 minutes were up, so, it was hooking me in a little bit.
Very cool. That is as glowing an endorsement as a 2600 game is probably going to get. Or at least, everybody, if you're going to do this, get 2 paddles, a bottle of Jack, and it becomes a party game.
There you go. And if you really want to emulate the Jedi in the movie, also do it blindfolded. Let the Force flow through you. And by the Force, I mean the bottle of Jack.
That actually sounds like an amazing, amazing YouTube video waiting to happen. And now that I've said it, I'm sure somebody's already tried it. Okay. Okay, with that being said, it's time to check in with our good friend Ethan to find out what I got wrong in our April 1983 jump in a little segment we call the Department of Corrections.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
the Department of Corrections.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. You may start the conversation now.
Welcome back, Ethan. So, before...
Wait, am I back? Or are you back here in the Department of Corrections?
Well, I'm back in the Department of Corrections. I was trying to make it sound good for me, but yeah, it's not good for me, is it?
Yeah, never quite. The 80s time is always a difficult time for Carl. I'm just to say that it was true back then too.
Yeah, the 80s was good to me. I was a kid having fun. Yeah, the 90s that was a little bit difficult, but oh well. So, okay, let's get this out of the way. We've got a laundry list.
For April 1983.
Yeah, to juxtapose itself with the wonderful Department of Corrections last episode. So, okay.
Yes, so we will commence out into this. And first of all, we have the Dale comment. Coming to you live from Canada. Dale, you know what I'm going to ask for. I need you to tell the curling story. Your initial condition is not going to happen. We need the curling story. Carl, next time he's on, you got to press him on the curling story.
I will press him on the curling story. We will find out what his curling story is.
It's video game related, is all I will say.
Oh, you know the story.
I know the outline of the story. I have not heard the whole story yet.
Oh, well, in that case, then, yes, I have a mission. I shall pull it from him through my unbelievable skills as a jurist. I will make
Carl skills.
Yeah, whatever. Okay, cool. We'll get it.
And something else in this discussion, I had a note here that said I have to mention the sports thing, and I don't remember what it was. I believe you guys said something dumb about EA Sports or something like that. Anyways, we will move on from that. Carl, Department of Corrections, I've written on your hands the most horrifying things that you can imagine. Will you read them out to the audience, please?
Let's see. Los Angeles was 1972.
That was the pinball ban. So we're starting in the 1973 thing. So the ban on pinball in Los Angeles was the first major city to have it lifted, and that happened in 1972. Then it was New York, and then it was Chicago, where all the games were made. So history is a twisted knot.
Gotcha. So okay,
now we can move into 1983, and we begin with the one that is close and dear to your heart, Dragon's Lair, of which we'll be hearing much of over the next couple months.
Yes. Very, very much so.
But as you mentioned...
I got the number... I quoted the number of scenes as per the magazines of the time.
But no, I think you actually said it in the discussion while you're doing it, so I can technically hit you for this.
It was part of my notes.
Yes, but I get to hit you for this. So it was not... Dragon's Lair does not have 42 scenes, even if you count the flipped scenes. It's 30 something. I remember I counted it. It's in the book. There were cutscenes, and it's not certain whether or not they had the idea to do the flipped scenes before they originally showed it at the show. I believe there were different reports on how many scenes there were, and I think Gary Goldman later said that they came up with the idea of doing the scenes flipped to try and get more stuff out. You know, they had the deadline. So I'm not 100% sure on all that, but it's 42 is not the right number.
Yeah. And like I said, I was just going off the number that was in the magazine, and I definitely should have cross-referenced that with the actual thing beforehand.
And this will be a link that you can find in the show notes.
Yes.
Next up.
Let's see. Yeah, next up. You want to do these or should I?
No. Read them off the hand.
Okay. Coleco's deal was not with Cinematronics. It was with Starcom.
So Starcom was the partnership that the heads, because it's not actually the companies, the heads of Don Bluth Productions, Cinematronics, and Advanced Microcomputer Systems made. So they made the partnership Starcom, which eventually becomes Magicom. And that is the company that actually, through all things Dragon's Lair and later Space Ace, went through.
Oh, okay.
And I have I have internal documents of the Starcom partnership, which again will detail the information on the whole situation in the book.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So they're the ones doing the licensing, and that's who Capcom gets Coleco gets the home rights from.
Yes. Rick Dyer is the one who did the actual negotiating, as told to me by the head writer on Dragon's Lair, because he was there as well, just for no reason. He wasn't part of the negotiation. He's just like, I think Rick liked company was his way of putting it. But yeah, Starcom were the people, the entity that signed on the dotted line was Starcom.
Cool. Okay.
Next up, other Dragon's Lair things. Bluth's Kickstarter, because I think he said Indiegogo. It did result in a small film, which was a private pitch of the the idea for a Dragon's Lair film. And currently Netflix has the active rights to a Dragon's Lair TV series ongoing.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I heard about that. Now, the fact that there was an actual pitch film put together, but it was just a pitch film. It wasn't an actual new animation. It was just sort of them talking about
it was some production. No, it was new animation. The financing was for, I believe, a 10-minute original animated film.
Oh, okay. That for some reason I had in the back of my head that project had failed. That new animation had failed.
No, I believe that they got the money for it. And then nothing's really been heard about it since, because it was not meant for the public. It was just meant to pitch to investors. And as far as I know, they were upfront about that, and people still funded it anyway. So I'm not sure they can really be mad about that.
No, they can't. Well, I mean, the guy who did the Goon comics, Eric Powell, he tried the similar thing several years ago, but he did not get his money for it, unfortunately.
Next up, on further Laserdisc developments, there was the Sea Captain one that you mentioned as, what was going to be the game they did after Dragon's Lair 2 and Space Ace. I'm trying, but something Barnacle. Whatever the name of that was. That was not the only one. There were several other pitches, and none of them ever got to the animation stage because the Laserdisc market fell out from under them, and acrimony between Don Bluth Productions and AMS resulted in no further game development happening from there on forward.
Gotcha. Now, the nature of the acrimony. Do you have any details there since you've dropped that?
It's in the book.
Okay, good. So everybody remember, when the book finally comes out, we will be promoting it here extremely heavily.
Yes, and just by my very nature of being here, we are promoting it. Then another Laserdisc thing. The Simultron system, which there's an upcoming interview which will cover some of this for the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. You did a news mention on the Simultron system. You said it was quote-unquote up and running. The centers never opened. There's no report that the Simultron centers ever actually became somewhere you could visit.
Well, now, what they ended up with was you could walk into them. They had the machine set up The video clips had been cut, but the game software wasn't working. Sorry. And I have the interview already done with the co-founder.
Yes, but he, the main programmer on the game, I'm sure that he remembers that he finished it and all that stuff. But there are some other people who were involved with this project who say that it never actually fully worked.
Well, and that's
so the centers can't be up and running if the whole thing doesn't work.
Well, no, they actually had the center laid out and ready to go.
Yes, there are pictures of it.
But
I'm aware.
The company he hired to do the software basically screwed him over. And there's a couple.
That is his perspective on it.
I know,
again, people on the other side have been interviewed about this.
I'm sure of it.
So we'll get you'll get that story sometime in the future once Carl gets through his incredible interview backlog.
Yeah, it's not as big right now, but yeah, it's still, I just don't have time.
The public could never visit these Simultron centers.
True.
That is the main point of this.
That is true.
Now we are finally off the Laserdisc train, I think. I don't think there's anything else coming up. But let us go on to another part of arcade culture affecting the world. You got to read it off, Carl. I wrote it on your hands.
Yeah. You're making me do all the work here? I tell you. Where are we here? Oh, there's so much here. There were studies on hand-eye coordination by 1983.
Yes, I think you said something along the lines of, everyone says video games and hand-eye coordination. It's like, is that actually true? And did they ever check? And yes, they did. They actually had done some studies on it by that time.
Yeah. And I think, the big thing was that even the people in the magazines were like, well, we were a little skeptical about whether or not that was a real thing. But yeah, it was a real thing. And I mean, you had the great scientist himself, Ronald Reagan, saying that it's got to be true. So there you go.
All right. Next up.
Oh, now I scrolled and now I don't know where I am. Sentai.
Yes, the name of the company is Sentai.
Sentai.
That's how you pronounce it.
Okay.
Sentai. In more Japanese tone. And on the same note, the company, it was in this story, I forget exactly how you worded it, but the company Videa, which I think you called Vidya, but I think it doesn't really matter because they never put out anything because they were bought by Pizza Time Theater and merged into the existing company of Sentai. So Videa was Sentai. All the people from Videa moved into Sentai.
Okay. That makes more sense. And then we have Atumnawa.
Yeah, well, however you pronounced it, the correct pronunciation is Atumnawa.
Atumnawa.
And yes,
okay.
Yeah, you have to kind of trip over your consonants in there.
Gotcha.
So that's where Twin Galaxies was, and the next one also pertains to Twin Galaxies.
Yes, Twin Galaxies did try to expand, but they had restrictive judging standards.
Yes, so they moved beyond high score stuff, and they tried to track competitive gaming generally, and they were the first hub for speedrunning. If anybody in the audience here has ever watched Summoning Salt's videos, Twin Galaxies does come up quite a bit. But Twin Galaxies was very restrictive in what they allowed people to do. They did not like saving and quitting the game to like skip, cutscenes or like go back to the beginning of levels. They would not allow that.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. So in speedrunning terms, people don't like Twin Galaxies.
I guess. I mean, I guess I understand it, but yeah, no. Okay. Then we have Japan didn't have a domestic programmable market, so launching in Japan wasn't a ridiculous idea.
This pertains to the Atari 2800 thing that we were talking about.
Yeah.
You were saying, it was they did come in late and it was expensive, but up to the point where the family computer, the Famicom, launched, there was nobody in Japan was making programmable home video game systems.
Yeah.
And pretty much everybody was trying to launch in Japan in 1983, including Mattel. Coleco tried, both through Nintendo and Sega, and a bunch of also ran consoles too.
Well, you also have to remember the VIC 1000 was already a year and a half old in Japan at this point.
Does that really count?
Oh, hell yeah, it counts. Didn't William Shatner teach you anything? He plays great games, too. I mean,
oh, sure.
When you think about the price difference, it's not that great. And it was a whole system, and it looked a lot better. And the idea that the Coleco was not coming, or that somebody else wasn't going to be entering that market, especially since all the good arcade games are coming out of Japan at the time. I mean, it's hubris. It was just hubris. I'm sorry, but trying to convince these people who are playing the latest, coolest games in the arcade that the 2600 is the way to go just smacks of, oh, they'll eat it because they don't know any better.
I mean, but my point is there's no domestic market.
No, I agree for 2 months.
Yeah, but they didn't know. Nobody knew it was coming.
Well,
till it was there.
Actually,
Sega knew,
I have
but
now found the news articles in the business journals showing that everybody knew, at least in the business side, knew that. I mean,
technically, Atari knew it was coming because they were doing the negotiations to put it out in North America.
Exactly.
But that they had no. Whatever, not going to go off into another argument of historical whataboutisms.
Yeah. It was just hubris.
Okay.
If they had launched the 5200, I would agree with you that would have been a wise choice. But.
All right, read the next thing on your thumb, Carl.
iMagic did that port to appease Magnavox.
The port is the Odyssey 2 port of Demon Attack.
Yeah.
I think you were just kind of saying they did it generally to expand into all these markets. No, the specific reason they did it was to make sure that Magnavox did not sue them for the patents. I don't know if they ever ended up paying for the patent stuff, but obviously Activision, the suit with them began in 1982, so they were going after the third-party developers. So iMagic wanted to get Magnavox on their good side. Here's our best game. Don't sue us, please.
Yeah, and it actually, because it's the first time anybody's bothered to be a third party on the Magnavox Odyssey, too.
And the only time.
Yeah, exactly. Not a great system for third-party development, apparently. Oh, well.
Then,
Yeah.
They were always the distant third and then fourth, I believe. Were they ever second? I guess they were second in 1978 because Fairchild was dipping away and the Bally Astrocade wasn't doing that strong.
And the Intellivision.
Yeah, they were second once.
Yeah, for a hot minute. Oh, well. And it had the keyboard. I mean, it would have been easy to program for. Apparently, maybe.
Yeah, sure it would.
So,
okay.
Quaker Oats still owned Fisher-Price. And I
think you said that they had divested them, but
I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if they owned them or didn't own them. Okay.
And that is who they, their U.S. game subsidiary was basically going through Fisher-Price. And that is the endless story. I think we talked about it in the crash of, Quaker Oats getting into video games. This is obviously a sign of the end times, but really it's Fisher-Price getting into video games.
Exactly. Then we had, technically the VIC-20 and ZX had the same number of colors. This is one where I screwed up. For some reason I had in the back of my head that the ZX Spectrum palette it has its base colors, and then it could do one variation on each of them. So the 7 colors
brightness
become
variations,
14.
basically.
Yeah. And and I thought it was 3, so I thought it was 21 colors. And the VIC-20 can do 16, so VIC-20 wins. Woohoo!
Yeah, the ZX Spectrum actually has 7 colors with a single variation of each, so adds up to 14. So this was a Department of Corrections correction as written. That was wrong.
Yeah. So, oh well. But we all know that it doesn't really matter because the C64 is going to kick the ZX Spectrum's ass. And that was just for
And
all my
finally,
UK
Carl.
friends. Yeah. Okay.
Down on your elbow, you have the final correction.
CBC did have teletext.
As you did a teletext segment in this episode, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, Dale, sir, yes, they did have teletext. They had a teletext channel for a while.
I have a Canuck on the show, and we still get this wrong? This is terrible.
He just never had engaged with it. Because, I mean, teletext is a weird kind of segment of things. Somebody needs to do, like, a real book on teletext. Because it's basically like BBS's, but just controlled by a central entity rather than an open form of various things. So I think that teletext is quite interesting, and yeah, that is all for the Department of Corrections for April 1983. We have been here a long time, Carl. You can lay your head down to rest and be at ease with yourself for now.
Awesome. Thank you, as always, sir, for your service.
Bye.
Yeah, some nitpicky ones in there this time. I need to add one more nitpicky one of my own that I accidentally discovered when I was looking at the wrong spreadsheet preparing for this episode. And this is really nitpicky, but that's okay. That's what we're here for. Exactly. You mentioned that when Nolan Bushnell was fired from Atari, he signed a non-compete, and that's why he was being sued over the whole Sente thing. And it's actually, and the press sometimes got this wrong at the time too, so it's an easy mistake to make. It may even be that the news source that you used had this incorrect, that it wasn't your error. It's actually when Warner bought Atari in 1976, they forced all of the principals at that time to sign 7-year non-competes. And so that's why his 7-year non-compete, because they bought it in September 1976, so that's why his 7-year non-compete was running out in October 1983.
That makes more sense. I couldn't figure out how the math was going to add up there. Mm-hmm. But that makes perfect sense then. Excellent. Thank you very much. So, you are now an honorary prison guard in the Department of Corrections? Okay.
Yeah.
With all of the bookkeeping aspects of the show out of the way, let's turn on the time machine and head back, not to 1983 just yet. We need to make a couple of stops before that. So let's head back. Now I got to do the math. 70 years to May of 1953. And we don't have any music here, so I'm just going to be like, Sandman, bring me a drink. Okay, no.
What a long, weird, strange trip this has been. Yes, here we are in 1953, and wouldn't you know, this seems like something that should be a headline in 2023. Computers learn how to learn.
The Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, or EDSAC, is a British machine that can apparently learn from prior mistakes. Now, its basic tricks, like learning to reject any number in a sequence it was told to reject, is simple, but Dr. Claude E. Shannon of Bell Telephone Laboratories, or Laboratories? Yeah, I'll go with laboratories at this point, predicts the newly introduced transistor will soon replace the vacuum tube and bring about a whole new generation of computers that will not only be extremely compact, but have much larger memories, allowing them to, quote, learn, unquote, much more, and maybe even begin to replicate themselves, as envisioned by Dr. John von Neumann.
There you go. So, in the context of the year 1953, ChatGPT is just 2 years away, right? That's where it's headed, right?
It's going to take I think even then they're thinking it's going to take a little bit longer. But this was a really interesting piece from the New York Times, just breaking this idea down. Now, the writer is apparently slightly skeptical of all of these ideas, but the true potential of the computer as a thinking tool and this mention of how the transistors are going to change it, all hugely, hugely important. Absolutely. And of course, the EDSAC, not apropos to this article, but there were a couple of very early computer games on the EDSAC, like the tic-tac-toe game by Alexander Douglas, and a game where you're trying to guide a bunch of sheep through a hole in a fence or some such thing like that. So, it all connects back. Oh, definitely. And it's very, very interesting that, this early in the game they're doing this. And, of course, Claude Shannon and John von Neumann are huge names in the history of computing. I'll put links to Wikipedia entries on them in the show notes if you guys want to hear more. So it was just kind of cool. So I thought I'd include it because we didn't have enough. We had to put some filler in this episode because we didn't have enough headlines, right? I just can't let a good story like this go. It's the format. Sue me. Okay, so let's turn on the time machine again, head forward another 10 years to May of 1963. And I got no idea. It's probably some Elvis stuff is playing at this point on the radio. I don't think the Beatles have come over yet in 63.
63 is too late for Elvis, really. He was back from the army and he had some hits in 62, and by 63 he's disappearing into his mediocre movies.
Ah, you're right. It's probably Jailhouse Rock or something at this point.
Oh, Jailhouse Rock was from the 50s.
Oh, that's right. Oh,
1957. My mom is a huge Elvis fan. You are. Don't test me on that. Don't test me on the Elvis.
Hey, I bow to your expertise in these matters, sir. So, okay, let's get the story out of the way.
Engstrom says computers are being underutilized.
Dr. Elmer W. Engstrom, president of the Radio Corporation of America, estimates that barely 1/4 of the practical uses of electronic computers have currently been found. He goes on to say that conceptual advances, new things to do with the machines, occupy as much research time as efforts to make the machines faster and smaller. He went on to say that the 12-year-old industry currently sells 10,000 systems every year.
Newsflash, company that sells computers says more people should buy computers.
That's true. But at the same time, I think it's interesting that he's talking about how it's the same thing Van Neumann was talking about was, what could these machines possibly do? And most of these huge, expensive machines are just being used for relatively mundane things like, let's collect a bunch of mail addresses and, send out junk mail or something.
Yeah.
And it's kind of sad.
And of course, this is right on the eve of IBM releasing its System 360 architecture, which is kind of the point where mainframe computing starts to spread a little more rapidly. So, right before people really do start to realize that, hey, maybe we can use a computer and integrate it into more of our operations. And It's right before, and 2 years before time sharing really gets going commercially. He's right. And we're right on the cusp of actually something being done about some of that and computing really exploding in the latter part of the 60s.
Yeah. And, fun times. And we're only a decade away from having a computer-like device in your home. Woohoo! But enough about that. We do have a sound effect for this one, so let's turn the dial to May of 1973.
The marriage of traditional pinball machines and computer technology.
1973.
An unsavory type of play.
Welcome back to May of 1973. Alex, what's our story?
It appears that Williams enters Pong clone market.
Paddleball is the name of Williams' entry into the popular, and this is a quote, popular two-player ping-pong competition game genre, end quote. It comes in an attractive wood box with a big yellow border around the screen. Can't imagine where they got that idea from. Yeah. Now, we've talked in the last few months about some very minor mentions in Cashbox and occasionally in newspaper articles, Cashbox being a trade publication for the coin-op industry, about Pong, but nothing really big yet. This is the first time that I've found an acknowledgement of this already being a very, very popular bit of kit. And the fact that Williams' machine literally looks like a one-to-one copy of Atari's machine, down to the color scheme, is very telling about the nature of the coin-op industry, especially at this point in time, but also historically. I mean, you've done a bunch of episodes on your show about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was definitely the coin-op industry has always been about, one or two lead and everyone else follows as fast as they can. And this is certainly an example of that. We don't know exactly where Williams' clone came from. It may have come from a company called MCA, Magnetic Corporation of America, because there's some stuff on the circuit boards that imply that. We do know that they actually went straight to the horse's mouth at first and were negotiating with Magnavox to do something. But let's just... I didn't mean Magnavox, so we'll cut that out.
Sorry.
Sanders. I meant Sanders.
Oh, Sanders. Okay.
Yeah. Went straight to the horse's mouth and was looking to do something with Sanders. But let's just say that the volume in the arcade is not the volume that some of those major contractors were used to doing, and the economics of that kind of thing just did not work. But they got a clone from somewhere. And... yeah.
And there you go. Now, interestingly enough, in this May 5th issue of Cashbox, the very next page after the Williams story is a 2-page ad for another Pong clone called Rally, which has a very different case structure. It's got sort of metallic finish and stuff on it. Looks almost like something you'd put in a cocktail bar. But, yeah. And then there's one more quote in that same issue that I thought was really, really cool. And I'll just read it. So, quote, about ping pong TV games, to quote Empire Distribution VP Joe Robbins from his recent newsletter, absolutely the phenomenon of the year and possibly one of the greatest income producers of all time. Some locations have reported huge, steady collections in our area for up to 2 months at this writing. Pointing to the present lineup of games on the market, plus the expected new equipment earmarked for May and June release by the game factories, Joe added, 1973 will be one of the most fantastic years in the history of our industry.
Yeah, I mean... it was a pretty unprecedented phenomenon in terms of recent years, how big those machines became so quickly. Rally, incidentally, was a clone by the very suggestively named 4Play Entertainment, which was also the only company to rip off Computer Space with their game Star Trek, which of course had no license whatsoever from the good folks at Paramount or Desilu or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and we talked about that last year when they did that. So it's interesting that they're also doing the Pong, but then again, everybody's doing the Pong. But in this quote, the suggestion that there's so many more companies about to release Pong machines.
Yes.
Is just phenomenal. Like I said, I haven't found any real mention of the ping pong game phenomenon up until this point. And I almost have this feeling that it's like, okay, Atari, nobody really knows Atari now that the big guys are doing it.
That's part of it, but another disconnect that a lot of people have that are looking back at this today is, all the websites and everything say Pong released November 1972. And that's true insofar as it goes. They made their first sales in 1972, but it was a small number of sales to local California West Coast distributors. It didn't actually go national until March of 1973. So March is really when the first units, not just Ataris, but also some of the first competitors, get out in the marketplace in a big way. It's the first month that Atari advertises in Cashbox. Then in April, the first of the big boys come in, and that's Midway, who actually license from Atari. It's not a pirated clone. And then now, of course, here in May, Williams is getting in, and, a couple of months have elapsed, and so it's gotten to the point where enough are out in the world, out in the marketplace, that people are like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, this is becoming a big thing. So yeah, it's a more narrow time frame than some people realize, because it's not really November 1972 to May 1973. It's really March 1973 to May 1973.
Gotcha. And we will see how this little boom, well, I'll put a link to your episode on this, because the Pong clone boom is going to have a bust. It won't take too long, but it will bust. And it's interesting that there was one mention in one of the cash boxes this month about how Atari is hinting that their next game is already doing really, really well on test. 2-player game. Alcorn is quoted there. I don't know which is the next game that they release after this. Is it
Space Race?
Oh, okay, yeah. So yeah, that'll be fun to see. I mean, how that gets reported on, and what I'm really looking forward to seeing is how Cashbox and the distributors and so forth distinguish the Pong games from any other output, especially the output from Atari after this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That'll be interesting to just observe over the next year. But, okay, we've done this. It's time for the main event. We're going to turn on the time machine one more time and head back to May of 1983.
Business has dropped in half over the past
1983. Certain types of games.
Business is like sex.
Praise to its peak.
Welcome back to May of 1983. Alex, what's our first story?
Coin-op continues to suffer.
We've talked a lot over the last year that coin-op has been in decline, with an oversaturation of operators and machines flooding every possible venue, and then some. Increased competition from the home market and increased pressure from local governments and parent groups. This month's Replay magazine, which is dedicated to operators, is really showing signs of the strain coming through. Their monthly On the Line feature, in which they asked several operators from around the country the same question, was about, quote, have you noticed a decrease in play on video games in your locations? End quote. All the respondents agreed that per-machine income was down. Some saw it as a result of competition from home games, citing big drop-offs after Christmas when machines would have entered homes, others blaming the weak economy, and others suggesting that kids are just figuring the games out too quickly.
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think that's probably all true.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, it's all of these factors are coming together. I mean, the kids are getting better and better at recognizing, what to do in the games. They're getting bored of the games faster. And let's face it, if you've got that machine at home and you can have your friends come over, it's not costing you 25 cents a hit, you're going to be playing more games at home. And with the dawn of games like Pitfall, suddenly you really have competition for the quality of graphics and the depth of gameplay that you didn't have before.
Mm-hmm. And then the other thing, and I haven't done too much study in this, but, video games do not exist in a vacuum. And I don't think it's entirely a coincidence that video games began their rise. I mean, obviously everyone loved Space Invaders and whatnot, but I don't think it's a completely coincidence that video games began their rise in a period of time when movies and music, two other things the teenagers spend a lot of money on, were in a bit of a slump on the whole. And then video games, coin-operated games, are starting to decline as blockbuster movies and new wave music and MTV and all of this are starting to make movies and music a bit ascendant again. There's also more competition for the teenage allowance in this time period than there was just a few years before.
That is definitely true. And it can't be ignored. I mean, just looking at the movies that are coming out around this time period, I mean, we're going to talk about them in the next couple of months, but I mean, we've got Blade Runner coming, War Games, and I mean, home computers and the fascination of home computers is also definitely going to be playing a part in all of this. But there is a return to the blockbuster. And I mean, for the little kids, it's the rise of the action figure. Mm-hmm. We're not going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it very, very briefly a little bit later. But number one toy in the country for the first few months of the year has been Masters of the Universe. But you also have G.I. Joe is huge at this point. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the rise of Strawberry Shortcake and all of that stuff. My Little Pony also just hit. It's just a whole different ballgame. And the cartoons that are about to come are going to take another whack at it because there's going to be a 2-hour block after school every day that you're going to want to watch instead of going down to the arcade.
Exactly. So all of these, I think, are probably playing a role. And then, of course, the operators themselves just way over-leveraged themselves, getting in on the gold rush too late, buying too many machines on credit, and it just wasn't working out.
Yeah, there's another big article, I didn't make a note of it, but talking about how there's just a rash of operator bankruptcies at this point. Mm-hmm. And so many of the people who entered the business the last 2 years are now just being wiped out. And it's only going to get worse from here.
Absolutely.
There's not a lot for them to go back to. Now, speaking of survival, the National Coin Machine Institute is sponsoring its first annual Industry Survival Seminar in Orlando, where they will not, quote, waste a lot of time bemoaning the industry's fate and the problems which have plagued it for years, some of which have developed since the federal government has ceased financing many state and municipal programs, end quote. Instead, the seminar will be a, quote, action workshop, end quote, to train operators to defend against government actions, legislation, and how to be proactive to save the industry. Yeah, it's,
no. Just no. Sorry, guys. Government's not even your biggest problem right now.
No, it's not. Now, a lot of those laws that were restricting arcades and stuff have been dying, but, that's not their problem. Now, they do make a point. They also released a report about the crippling effects of government action on the industry, including potentially destructive taxes on cigarettes. Now, that is something that's going to be hitting them fairly hard. And when you're reading through these coin-op magazines, the role of cigarette dispensers for a lot of these people in their operations is still huge at this point.
Right.
I still remember seeing them every time we went to Denny's, it was one of those Denny's that also had a cocktail lounge, and in the cocktail lounge, you could definitely see the cigarette machine was there. And
exactly.
You could still smoke at Denny's.
Yeah, right. And that's very true. I mean, because vending was largely a separate coin-op industry from amusements, with the one exception of the cigarette vending machine, because, of course, before the video game arcade had kind of really redefined things here very recently, it had been a bar and tavern trade. And what does a bar or tavern have? They have a jukebox for the tunes, and then they have a cigarette machine for the smokes, and then they have a couple of games for the entertainment. And so those kind of went hand in hand. So what you're seeing here especially are things that are going to really start wiping out the street location, which in a lot of ways never recovers. Certainly for video games, never recovers. I mean, there continue to be certain types of coin-operated games in bars and taverns, but it's really the beginning of the end for the video game part of it.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Now, in another sign of how the industry is suffering, there's a story about a Baltimore charity that received arcade games from Atari as a donation. And apparently Atari, now didn't all go to this one charity, but Atari's giving away 151 cocktail Space Duel machines that are just sitting around and they can't get rid of them.
Those poor sick kids getting those Space Duel machines.
Now, the article was also interesting because there's a quote in there from, I believe, a distributor or an operator, and it says that the average machine income has dropped to just $109 a week. Now, that's a number that they're quoting. I'll leave it at that. And this person's also saying that most operators showed a loss in 1982. So it would be interesting to see. I mean, I don't know how accurate that number is or how localized that number is, but $109 a week is not going to pay off a $3,000 machine before it goes out of style, or a $2,000 machine, or even a $1,500 machine.
Mm-hmm.
So
exactly.
It's just miserable income. And we've talked about it on the show countless times over the last year, the rise in popularity of conversion kits and so forth, obviously being a way to maybe mitigate this, but there's just too much product out there at this point. It's
exactly.
Yeah.
But speaking of the government a second ago, even though it's not the biggest enemy, it is still out there, and we do have an update on those shenanigans as Bally beats city of Mesquite.
The long-running legal wrangling in the case of Aladdin's Castle versus City of Mesquite has come to an end. We first talked about it back in our January 1982 ep, but the case originally goes back to 1977 when the Texas city passed an ordinance barring those under 17 from playing coin-operated amusements without parental supervision, in response to Bally's attempt to open an Aladdin's Castle location in the city. The Supreme Court punted an appeal by the city back down to the lower court for clarification. The Fifth Circuit has now clarified that Texas law provides sufficient grounds to declare the ordinance invalid, sadly for the industry leaving it without a federal precedent to help fight other such ordinances in other states.
Yep.
Yeah.
Not a lot to say there. I mean, people bring up this case a lot because it's like the first video game case that went to the Supreme Court, but it's actually a bunch of really finicky technical stuff, and the Supreme Court's all salty because it's like, well, Congress restricted our ability to rule on matters of state law, so we're just going to have to throw this one back. And so it's kind of petering out with a whimper here, though I'm not sure it's all the way done yet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Mesquite is going to try to continue to prevent Aladdin's Castle from coming in. I don't know how long it'll be even a relevant issue for them, but...
Right.
Yeah. But it is being heralded in all the magazines as a great victory to a certain extent. But they, again, at least Replay, and these are for those who are just jumping in now, Replay and Play Meter are two of the big coin operator journals, if you will, monthly magazines dedicated to the industry. And Replay was pretty sanguine about how this really doesn't give everybody the big win that they were hoping for.
Mm-hmm.
And the Lance Castle, was primarily mall-based, if not exclusively. I don't know if they had any standalone operations at this point in time.
Right.
But, they were as family-friendly as you were going to get.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But that old prejudice, we got trouble right here in River City with a capital T that rhymes with P that stands for pool. It's the same idea that these kind of locations bring in all the riffraff.
Oh, yeah. And actually, that analogy of the pool table or the pool hall bringing in riffraff is actually going to be brought up in another article we'll talk about a little bit.
But first, we have more legal shenanigans to get to as Magnavox sues Bally over Pac-Man royalties.
Magnavox has filed suit against Bally Midway for their failure to pay royalties on arcade games, including the mega-hit Pac-Man, which Magnavox says were owed based on a 1974 settlement agreement granting Bally the license to use Magnavox patents. Magnavox claims a $25 per machine license fee, which hasn't been paid since 1976, meaning that millions could be due.
Now, I just know, I don't know this for sure because that's not like I know this from the historical record, but I just know this was a response to the Casey Munchkin case. It's like, okay, because even though, Atari was kind of the big one, Bally Midway as the rights holder to the arcade game was also part of that suit. So they were like, okay, you're going to block our Pac-Man clone game from coming to market? Then we're just going to take the money from your Pac-Man game.
Yeah, the fact that they haven't collected since 76, and now that Casey Munchkin is over as a case, this just
it's still ongoing. They had the big injunction, but the case is still lurching along.
Oh, okay. You're right. Yeah, it was an injunction. They couldn't sell it anymore.
We don't actually know when the case ended. It probably ended in a settlement, probably around 1984. But Ethan pulled the docket because the case is in Chicago, and we can't even tell from there when it really ended. People that don't understand the legal system get confused, and they think that decision in 81 was like a decision on the case, but it was only a ruling on the temporary injunction that was appealed to the Seventh Circuit or whichever circuit it was. And then they said, yes, the temporary injunction can stand, but then the case actually had to continue after that. So it's still ongoing at this point because it kept going at least until 1984, but which makes it even more likely that this is some kind of tactic to put pressure on the people that are suing them.
Exactly. Or just to make a boat ton of money because, as we'll see, it's kind of obvious Magnavox knows the Odyssey 2 is not long for this world. But
pretty much. And yeah, we both looked, I think, we go month by month, but just to spoil the end, we both looked, I think, and couldn't find how this actually got disposed of.
No, and Ethan also, I talked to him and I put a question in the Gaming Alexandria forums on this. He's fairly certain that they ended up paying out, but this would have been a massive payout that would have shown up on Bally's book someplace.
Yeah, it would have had to because they're a publicly traded company, so they have to report out things like big legal settlements. So I don't know. Maybe they buried it in the same quiet hole, and I mean this seriously. They may have buried it in the same quiet hole as the Casey Munchkin case. Maybe they just all agreed to drop their litigation against each other and move on with their lives. We just don't know the final disposition of the case.
That's true. If they never actually paid out to North American Phillips, that could be how it played out.
Yep. But anyway, we're done with the old, and now it's in for the new, because Mario Brothers debuts at AOE.
The Amusement Operators Expo in Chicago saw the premiere of several new games, including Bally Midway's Professor Pac-Man and Nintendo's Mario Brothers. Both games are following a relatively new trend of being shown before the machines are even ready for final delivery. Professor Pac-Man and Rockola's Rocket Race will both be tweaked before launch to make adjustments based on operator suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, this is just another sign of how crowded the industry has become. I think they need to stake out their mind share as quickly as they possibly can, plus be able to respond to feedback at the shows to try to make the games even better, because the competition is just so thick at this point. You can't, if you're waiting till your game's all ready for sale, you're probably already too late in this climate.
Oh, definitely. And they're probably also not... I mean, if you're showing up at the show saying, this is our new game, you can buy it right now. It means you had to produce it ahead of time. And you know that they're showing these things around, and if they do not get a good response, this way they don't have to produce it.
Exactly.
And I mean, I had never even heard of Professor Pac-Man, and I looked it up as some weird trivia game. It does not look
Yeah, it's a Dave Nutting Associates strangeness.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
I do believe. So, lots of big things in the works for Nintendo here, because in addition to debuting Mario Brothers, Nintendo also moves to Tokyo Stock Exchange.
Yes, venerable Japanese toy maker turned arcade game juggernaut Nintendo has filed an application with the Japanese Finance Ministry for permission to list their stocks in the first section of the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Currently, the company is listed on both the Osaka and Kyoto exchanges, but now it's time to move to the big time, with an expected launch in July and 1.5 million shares being made available, which will come from several existing large investors and company CEO Mr. Yamauchi himself.
And yeah, I mean, that just shows how gangbusters they've been going in the post-Donkey Kong era, because they're even skipping a step here, because there is a second section of the Tokyo Stock Exchange, which is kind of the less prestigious section. And so, obviously, anything Tokyo is more prestigious than anything Osaka and Kyoto, but they're also skipping straight to the first section and bypassing the second section. So, I mean, they're on fire at this point.
Oh, yeah. And, well, I've already done a little bit of pre-production for next month, because next month we'll see the launch of the NES in Japan.
Looking forward to this.
And I did find a good article from a Japanese financial publication in English about it. And one of the things that they do mention is that about, if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, we'll talk about it again next month, 76% of Nintendo's coin-op video game revenue at this point is coming from exports to North America. Mm-hmm. Which, I mean, that's always been one of those shady bits where I could never really tell how much was the U.S. market, how much was the Japanese market. But that means that they are very, very reliant on it. And considering the timelines of when they built their massive new facilities in Washington State, when they said in the original application for permits in King County that they wanted to do home computers and technology there, it makes perfect sense that the Famicom was meant to be brought over. There's no way that they weren't thinking about that. And again, the way that they describe the Famicom in that news article, they're not thinking game console. They're thinking this is, console with game add-on, with computer add-on, the same way that everybody else seems to be doing that in the last 4 or 5 months in the U.S.
Absolutely. Because, of course, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more next month, but there is a looming specter that will come up next year on the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine within the Japanese industry, is that everybody knows that some heavy new government regulation of game centers is inevitably coming. And it's not a coincidence that both Nintendo and Sega choose to pivot in this time period into the home. And it's not a coincidence that Nintendo, to tie it more in with this episode, is doing more of its arcade business in coin-op business in the United States than in Japan, because they are trying to wean themselves off of coin-op in Japan and transition to the home because of this regulation that the entire industry in Japan believes is going to be absolutely apocalyptic for their business.
Yep. And on that note...
Yes, speaking of apocalyptic businesses, we're a little late to the party here, Replay, because malls embrace arcades, they say.
Yes, while malls have traditionally been reluctant to rent space to arcades due to their less than savory reputation, cue the music from earlier.
We got trouble.
According to a Chicago Tribune article, the desire to get a taste of arcade profit seems to be winning out. On a per square foot basis, arcades seem to be earning as well as jewelry stores and fast food chains. A relevant factor is malls tend to get a percentage of gross sales, and arcades can generate about $200 a square foot per year, twice as much as department stores.
Yeah, and of course the mainstream press, for anything, we're not just talking about video games, with anything, the mainstream press always lags behind a little bit when they figure out something's big. So the Chicago Tribune here is reporting on this when we're really at about the stage where it's all going to fall apart and they're all going to leave the malls, because really this has been happening for some time, but it just shows that now that the mainstream press is starting to realize that, oh, hey, these arcades in malls, they're a thing. They're big.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, not for long.
Not for long, but I think the thing that caught my eye was the way that the money is broken down between the renter at the mall and the mall owner.
Yes.
And I didn't know about the percentage going to the mall operator, to the owner of the mall. That changed my perspective of it quite a bit, because it really does influence, what kind of businesses you want in that mall. You need to be generating a fairly large amount of revenue, not just to pay the rent. And this is coming off the gross sales. It's not, the profit margin. And the arcade still has that profit margin on top because, it's not gross sales of inventory that you have to buy and sell. It's, leasing out small amounts of time on individual machines.
Yep.
So, no, it was a pretty fascinating bit. So, just from the numbers.
Absolutely. A great peek into the economics. And speaking of arcades, Atari enters the arcade biz.
That's right. Atari has announced that they have acquired MagnaFun, a Philadelphia-based arcade operator with 40 rooms under the name Spaceport Recreation. The company's two principals will remain on to manage the operations.
Yep, Atari's flirted with arcade several times, even as early as 1973, right after we found it, as we covered on the machine. It's the same impulse that made Bally want to own casinos. It's like, we make the slot machines, we make the arcade machines, and we make money on them, but the operating is where the real money is. And so when you have an opportunity to try to plunge into the operating side as a manufacturer without alienating your entire customer base, you tend to try to do that. And obviously Atari's getting in here a little late, but it makes sense why they would want to be in the operating business.
Oh, definitely. Especially because they really, really, really need some new sources of income. As everybody knows, we're in the middle of the crash. The crash is still going at this point. The crash started in December. And if you haven't listened to our special crash episodes, links are in the show notes, and just go back through the archive. Those are important. But yes, we are in the middle of the crash.
Absolutely. And let me tell you, I don't have a transition for this next one, but it feels like this headline comes out of 2023, which just reminds you how the more things change, the more they stay the same. Because unions see tech as future of organized labor.
With the ever-dwindling workforces in the traditional industrial sectors of America, union organizers are attempting a new push in the tech sector. With increasing exportation of jobs to Southeast Asia and a recession that may be ending soon, unions see an opportunity to penetrate industries that have avoided organization of their workforces so far through the allure of stock options and other amenities.
And, of course, this is literally going on again right now, which is what I think is so funny about that, with some of the first unions in video game companies starting to be formed. Here
exactly.
And
there. And, you know, it's a very, very interesting bit. I mean, for a lot of people, this probably would have been when they're reading this coming from a New York Times article, it's probably the first time people had heard of the concept of employees getting stock options in these tech firms.
Yes.
And they really have to explain it in the article. It's like, you know, they're going to get part of it if the company becomes successful and all this other stuff. And that is one of those, the new ones, because the whole idea that you're working at a company that, let's say, makes software and you making new copies of the software once it's created doesn't really cost anything, would have been a very foreign concept to any blue-collar workers, you know, in what will soon be known as the Rust Belt. But doesn't have that moniker yet, I don't believe. So, and it's also a good reminder of just where the general U.S. economy is at this point. It's also very similar to the situation in England at this point. So this pivot to technology, the idea of, you know, buy a computer for your kids because if they don't know how to use computers, they're never going to have a job because the factory won't be there for them.
Right.
You know, is very relevant to understanding a lot of the stuff that's going on here.
Absolutely. And did someone mention exporting jobs to East Asia? Because I hear that the Alabama legislature votes to boycott Atari.
Nice transition. You are on fire today. As retribution for Atari moving their manufacturing operation from Alabama to Hong Kong and Taiwan, the Alabama legislature has almost unanimously voted to ask the citizens of their state to not play their Atari today, or tomorrow, or ever again.
I see what you did there.
Yeah, thank you. I was very proud of that one. The loss of 1,700 consumer product production jobs is, of course, just one of thousands such moves, with virtually all consumer electronics manufacturing having moved to the Far East already. The wage cost difference is, of course, enormous, with the typical assembly line worker costing $9 an hour in Alabama, while their counterpart in Hong Kong made only $1.20, and the Indonesian worker just 19 cents.
Yeah, and this is really kind of the first period of this. This is new. There were a small number of companies that had moved offshore in the 70s, but mainstream American companies, I mean, there were always the Hong Kong, well, not always, but, you know, in the 70s, there were the Hong Kong and Taiwan manufacturers that went through small trading companies to bring their products to the United States. But like the mainstream reputable American companies, with very few exceptions, weren't outsourcing to East Asia in the 70s, but they suddenly realized in the face of the recession at the beginning of the 1980s and all of the stagflation that had rocked them at the end of the 70s, they needed to look for cheaper options. And so this is really right here at the beginning of the 80s, the beginning of this massive offshoring of American manufacturing jobs. And Atari is very much a part of that. They don't completely offshore at this point. They still have their El Paso plant, but they are heavily moving offshore.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, that first bit was from Play Meter's May 1st magazine. Now, Play Meter comes out twice a month. Their May 15th publication talks about an additional 350 of its 1,000 coin-op manufacturing staff have been cut down to a 4-day work week. to adjust for the slower market. So that's, I mean, it's not offshoring it, but it's cutting back even further.
Exactly. And that was at their Sunnyvale.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that was at their Sunnyvale factory, which is where they did their coin-op manufacturing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough time, and it's going to keep getting tough because Atari is going to keep making cuts.
And this coming out of the New York Times from the 24th of May. Another 225 employees will be cut by Atari following 1,700 cuts a few months ago in an effort to trim down its costs to deal with the new realities of the video game market.
Yeah, it's, this is, of course, still the Kassar regime, but I've talked to Kassar, but not about this, but I also talked to his successor, James Morgan, who will also go through a series of layoffs. And, I just kind of want to point out here, I mean, yeah, it's brutal and yeah, it's bloody, but the CEOs of Atari, we have this tendency to talk about how corporations see their people as expendable and they'll just cut people. And of course that happens sometimes, but these people are human too. And it actually sometimes does bother them. And James Morgan, at least in his time there, he said that, one of the problems, because this story keeps coming up. They cut this many, and it's going to keep coming up. And as by way of explaining that, at least James Morgan's way of looking at it was he was really trying to just cut enough for the company to recover. Like Morgan, and I presume Kassar as well before him, didn't want to be hatchet men and just lay everybody off and reset. They really were trying to save as many jobs as they could. And as Morgan himself admits, they inadvertently, with their good intentions, made it worse because they always underestimated how many people they had to get rid of. And so at the end, it ended up hurting the company more, and by extension, hurting the employees they were trying to save more by doing these waves of layoffs instead of just, cauterizing the wound, cutting off the arm, cauterizing the wound all at once to just try to make the bleeding stop,
Yeah. Well, and I mean, one of the people who's going to end up getting caught up in all of this is a friend of the show, Kevin Hayes, who comes over from Atari Ireland to basically take over some of the operations, and then suddenly it's just going to be like, okay, now I'm out of a job.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this is, and if you guys want to listen to that interview, I'll put a link in the show notes. It's
a good one.
Yeah, he really goes into the details of, what the business was like at that point. But yeah, I mean, Atari is bleeding cash, and you're right. They probably needed to make some really big moves, but
it's not so easy to do. It's sometimes hard to pull that trigger. But yes, Atari keeps bleeding, and as Atari keeps bleeding, Warner losses mount.
Steve Ross, head of Warner Communications, parent company of Atari, has announced that they expect the second quarter of 1983 to bring with it a loss of $18.9 million, largely on the back of Atari's dismal performance. He hopes to bring the company back to profitability in the second half and says that they are busy working on fixing Atari. In the second quarter of 1982, Warner posted a profit of $68 million.
Yep, not much more to say that hasn't already been said. This is just, since we go month by month, we're just watching the train crash in slow motion is basically what's happening here.
Yeah. And the fact that there's, just nothing they can do with this massive problem. I mean, $68 million in 1982 came almost exclusively from Atari. And now the losses are coming almost exclusively from Atari. And as you've always said, it's the tail wagging the dog. I mean, Warner should not be this easy to maneuver. But then again, hey, we're going to see that with AOL later on. So,
yep. Yeah, as bad as what Warner's going through now, it's not nearly as ridiculous as what Time Warner is going to go through in a couple of decades.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, let's turn our attention to the console space and one of my favorite topics, distribution, as we talk about Parker Brothers losing their injunction against Atari.
Atari's plan to move to force its distributors to exclusively carry entertainment software from Atari was objected to by Parker Brothers, who got an injunction stopping Atari from moving ahead with their new contracts, as we reported on in our March 1983 episode. That injunction only lasted 4 days, though, and Atari is moving forward with their new contracts while Parker Brothers is preparing to take them to court for violating antitrust laws and will seek triple damages on their estimated loss in order of over $15 million.
Yeah, I mean, they got no chance on antitrust here, because really the video game industry and Atari's model is the unusual model. Exclusivity with your reps is the industry norm. And it's not like they've tied up every industry rep. Parker Brothers has other... They're trying belatedly to cover up their own boo-boo, which is giving all of their competitors instant distribution in the market by not signing exclusivity contracts with their reps in the first place. And yeah, it's a giant mess. It's a mess for Atari as well as Parker Brothers. And it's not surprising that Parker Brothers is trying to stop this because of the path that they are taking on it. But it's not really antitrust because Atari does not have a stranglehold on the distribution. They're literally third-party reps. Those reps aren't even owned by Atari. They can choose not to sign the exclusive contracts and go with Parker Brothers instead. It's free market.
Yeah. And let's face it, it's... I mean... At this point, and this is something that came out in the toy industry publications this month, pretty much everybody has already written off the 2600 as yesterday's news, and the ColecoVision is the console of today, as one retailer put it. So the fact that, Parker Brothers... Their argument is that, Atari has extra leverage because of the sales of hardware. That won't even really stand up in court if you actually brought in industry numbers at this point, because the 2600 is on its way out and the Coleco is on its way in. But, that's another issue entirely.
Exactly. It's a software market now, which is why Mattel sues Atari in this same time period.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the lawsuits are flying fast and furious. Mattel, makers of the Intellivision, have sued Atari, claiming that Atari lured away 3 of its employees and plan on using their trade secrets to begin making Intellivision-compatible games. This, of course, is coming a year after Mattel began making 2600 carts.
Yeah, pot, meat, kettle a little bit. I mean, obviously, you can't use trade secrets, which presumably... Atari's not going to do, because spoiler alert, you can clean room reverse engineer these systems without too much difficulty, especially something like the Intellivision, which is based on almost entirely catalog parts from General Instruments. There's nothing proprietary to Mattel in there.
Yeah.
So, no. But, everyone's desperate at this point. Everyone's feeling the heat because they're feeling the squeeze on their own operations. It's not so much that they really feel that Atari stole trade secrets from them. It's that they're scared to death of Atari competing with them on the Intellivision because the Intellivision market is in real trouble.
Well, and let's also not forget, when they were doing the Plimpton ads, Atari's response to that was, only Atari's got... Missile Command. Only Atari's got, X, Y, and Z. And I believe it was Arnie Katz in one of his newsletters wrote this month, well, if Atari's going to do this, if Atari's going to be releasing its games on the ColecoVision and on the Intellivision, what is the purpose of the 5200? Because the 5200... technically, very different chip and everything, but technically on par with the ColecoVision. Right. If I can get all of the Atari exclusives on there, plus the Coleco exclusives, because Coleco has not made any announcement so far that they're going to be porting anything to the 5200. They'll do it to the lesser systems, but they're not going to port Donkey Kong Jr., and so forth to the 5200. So, it's great. They'll sell 1 million cartridges to 2600 owners, and at the same time dangle the carrot of you could have had a much better version of it.
Pretty sneaky.
What is the value proposition of the 5200 then? And this was a serious question he asked, and he's perfectly right that it makes no sense if Atari's going to do this, but it's a pure desperation move, and Atari is going to start launching everything they can at the Intellivision and I believe even the ColecoVision through their Atari Soft.
I think it's funny how you say, and I think the ColecoVision, when in fact our very next headline, someone's not reading ahead, is Atari to release Coleco carts. So let's continue this conversation.
Yes. Rumor has it, according to the video game update, that Atari plans on releasing games for the ColecoVision. While this would definitely provide them with some new income, the question the newsletter wonders is what role would be left for the 5200. This was the argument I was just talking about.
Exactly.
And, this is how late it is, everybody. I have actually forgotten the next story that I wrote.
Because for the record, he writes all of these.
Yes,
I just get to show up and comment on them. He writes them.
That's very, very true.
We've already covered this basically, and it is a desperation move because Atari is getting so hammered on the 2600, which is still where the majority of its sales come from, and there's so much competition on the 2600. They're doing Atari Soft and spreading onto everyone else's systems, not just consoles, but also home computers, almost in a desperation play because they're getting suffocated on their own system. And yes, then it destroys the value proposition of their own new system. Atari's just caught between so many forces, which we talk about in our Crash episodes. They're just caught between so many forces now that they're lashing out in every direction, and every move they make is wrong. Not because they're idiots, but just because there almost isn't a right move anymore at this point.
Yeah. Well, and when you think about the 5200 launch library was all games that were at least 2 years old.
Yes.
I mean, Pac-Man, Missile Command, and so forth. They looked better, but you had to play them with a 5200 controller, which is a fate worse than death in most cases. But yeah, it's just absolutely crap.
And no backwards compatibility. And people, there are a lot of people that like to crap on the marketing people at Atari. No backwards compatibility, and we have this from interviews on the engineering side. It was the engineers that were like, well, this is an advanced new system, and we don't want to belittle it by having it play these inferior products. Oh. The engineers made that decision that they didn't want backwards compatibility in the 5200, and it's like, ugh.
Yeah. Before we move on to more Atari stuff, there's one little bit I did want to talk about, the financial numbers from Mattel. Since we talked about the Intellivision. Now, they've reported their 1982 financials, and while they had $1.3 billion worth of revenue and sales increased a whopping 18.3% year over year. Now, remember, they also had Masters of the Universe this year. It was still a massive drop in operating profits, which fell by $17.9 million to only $130 million. Okay, so they're still turning $130 million in profits, but that's 17.9 less than the previous year on revenue of $1.3 billion. So it would have been, it's 10% profit, if you will, 10% return, and they lost, 10%, more than 10% of that. Now, the fourth quarter saw them lose $20.2 million compared to income of $16.7 million the previous year, largely on significantly increased price competition in the video game and related home computer industry. That's their line.
Right.
So just thinking about that, it's freaking insane. They've got the number one boys toy on the planet, and they're pulling $20.2 million basically just because the Intellivision is crapping out on it.
Yeah, it got, as we talked about in our Crash episodes, it just got squished between the cheaper 2600 and the more advanced ColecoVision. And in that holiday season, it just got flattened between those two competing forces. You could get cheaper or you could get better. And there was no need for something that was barely cheaper than the best and not nearly as good a system as the best.
And was going to cost you a whole lot more if you tried to turn it into a computer than, let's say, a real computer like the VIC-20.
Exactly. So they were just a mess there.
Yeah.
So that's Mattel. But we've got so much more Atari, because now Atari is teaming up with MCA.
Oh, yeah. They still haven't learned their lesson from E.T., apparently. So... Movie studio MCA has agreed to form a joint venture with Atari, MCA Video Games Inc., to create games based on its movie and television properties.
And, of course, this is an extension of the rapport that was established, for better or for worse, during the ET negotiations, because MCA is the parent company of Universal, the company that distributed E.T. And Skip Paul, whom I've now talked to, who is the general legal counsel at Atari, had kind of started, even though Ross made the final deal on the E.T. license before Ross had stepped in. Paul had been trying to negotiate it. He'd kind of struck up a bit of a rapport with Sid Sheinberg and Lou Wasserman over there. And so this is kind of extending that, and then ultimately Skip Paul, when the Atari thing falls apart, leaves and becomes the number 3 executive at MCA.
So at least it worked out for him. As far as I can tell, no games actually get released based off of this licensing deal. It's just coming way too late in the game.
Exactly. You know, Atari had really started getting heavily into licensing kind of by the tail end of 1982 of like non-video game properties. Obviously, they'd been in the licensing of video games, ever since Space Invaders in 1980. But in late 1982, they really kind of made it a mission to lap up just about every last license they could possibly get. So they ended up with a lot of licenses, but very few games ended up being released from all of those licenses, just because it's in the process of everything falling apart. And so they just don't get the product out the door.
And Howard Scott Warshaw just couldn't put out that many more games.
Right. But of course, they're not abandoning. Just because they're going after the MCAs and children's television workshops of the world doesn't mean that they're abandoning their video game roots in licensing either, because Atari also signs a Williams deal.
Williams Electronics, makers of arcade hits like Defender and Robotron, have signed a long-term agreement with Atari, granting Atari the right of first refusal to home video game and computer conversions of their arcade games. This comes in addition to Atari buying the home rights to Williams' Moon Patrol and Joust.
And Atari does have a massive hit with Defender, so playing nice with Williams here, signing with Williams does work out pretty well for them under the circumstances.
Oh, yeah. And they will release a lot of home conversions across all platforms. Like we said, with the Atari Soft label. And a lot of those licenses will then stay with Atari as it moves on to other owners later on.
Absolutely. And it is a pretty flooded market, though, and it is a pretty distressed market. And so we talked about how a lot of that MCA product doesn't come out from Atari, but there are console game delays piling on all over the industry at this point.
Oh, yeah. As the true extent of the fiasco that was Christmas 1982 becomes apparent, many of the titles announced at the January CES have failed to ship. The Video Game Update newsletter details how, with the exception of Activision, Atari, and Coleco, all the manufacturers have either failed to keep the schedules or released little to no product at all in the new year. Some of this may just be the usual issues of development, with many projects being reworked to improve quality in a much tighter market, but many of the titles announced will never be released given the newly recognized financial realities of the industry.
Yeah, so of course we're covering May 1983 right now. The CES is in June. And as we talked about in our Crash episode, the January CES, it was kind of like, oh, this could be bad, but we're all going to soldier on. And then, this is kind of a lead-in to what we'll cover in the next couple of months, which is the June CES, when everyone realizes that, oh, we're not going to soldier on. And this is just kind of the beginnings of that, the beginning of the press coverage leading up to CES and the real bloodbath that's going to unfold there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's going to be bad. Yeah.
But Atari keeps on wheeling and dealing, because they're also signing a deal with Synex.
Atari has announced that they have signed a deal with Synex Manufacturing to secure license rights to some of their computer and video game tech. As far as I can tell, this will result in the Atari wireless joysticks.
Good for them.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of weird. I'm wondering, with all of these announcements, is it Warner saying, keep announcing good news in order to maybe make people think everything's okay? Or is it just the weird delay of they've been working on these deals for a long time and they're coming to fruition, and the people at Warner, Steve Ross, just keeps getting these reports on his desk. Oh, Atari signed another bad one. Oh, Atari signed another bad one. And he's just like, when will the bleeding stop?
Can't stop, won't stop.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to picture it in my head.
Right.
You have all these executives who are like, oh, I'll get a bonus if I get this signed on time. And now they're all basically just piling this shit on in the hopes that, they'll get their money before the whole thing collapses.
Pretty much. And speaking of companies that are just trying to make some money before the whole thing collapses, Amiga introduces the Power.
The Power! A 2600 cartridge that can load games into memory has been introduced. We talked about this one a few months ago before it had the name The Power. I just needed to talk about how bad that name is. That's the only reason I included it, because it's a terrible name, and it's just like the Star Path. It's all these loaded from a cassette setups, and yeah, it's not going to help Amiga on their path to making the Super Machine. But it's fun to know that they were going to call it The Power.
Yes, they do not have the touch. They do not have the power.
Castle Grayskull is not standing behind them, waiting to turn their cat into
That's right.
No, quite the other way around. It's
Cringer and Battle Cat, or whatever it's called. I don't know.
You young'uns have no respect for the proper mythologies here. No, okay, I'm just kidding.
Hey, come on now. Masters Universe lasted into my child. I have Masters Universe action figures. I watched the cartoon.
The first one, or are you talking about the new adventures?
No, of course not. The real one.
Oh, okay, good. Okay,
I was still floating around in my childhood. I was born in 1981. I mean,
okay, yeah, that's right. You would have been there for the Dolph Lundgren movie. Yeah, so that's cool. Exactly.
They released their last line of new figures in 1987, and they hung around the toy stores a little longer than that. I have a He-Man and a Battle Armor Skeletor, a Webster, a Clawful, a King Randor, a Sorceress.
Ooh, nice. I never did get Sorceress.
And a Rio Blaster with all of his guns coming out of everything. I've got these things.
See, Rio Blaster was the one figure in the later lines after I had stopped buying them that I was like, I wish I had Rio Blaster. Just looks so badass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the one to have.
He was awesome. He truly was awesome. And the fact that they didn't get to him in the 2000 line, it hurts a little bit. Rio Blaster versus Trapjaw. Now, there's a fight I want to see. Okay, moving on.
Absolutely. Time to move on to some more hardware as Vectrex to go color.
In addition to the already announced Light Pen, Vectrex has announced that they have figured out a way for the existing black and white console to produce color images without using an overlay. Of course, we would never see this, but it is interesting to think what they could have been considering.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a prototype that exists, and it does not work because there is a giant hole in the middle of the screen.
Well,
because
depending on the type of game you build.
Well, no, because you see, here's the thing about color vectors. With color vectors, like with regular raster scan, you can have one electron gun that does everything because there's phosphors on the screen and whatever, and that's how it's done. But because you're scanning the whole screen with vector technology, if you want color vectors, you have to have 3 guns shooting at the screen to do the 3 different colors. You have to have one dedicated to each. And the thing about that those raster guns is that if you keep them in one spot too long, if you keep the beam in one spot too long, it will burn a hole through your screen because it's shooting all of those electrons at that one spot over and over again. And this was a challenge to try to figure out even on black and white raster displays. You had to make sure that you were never leaving the beam in one place too long. You were constantly deflecting it to make sure that you didn't burn anything in or burn out the screen. But now you have to keep track of 3 guns and make sure that they're never staying around long enough. And obviously there were some color vector arcade games, so it wasn't impossible, but that was much more expensive technology. So they did work on this, but the one prototype that's still known to exist, and I think it's been displayed at some retro shows and whatnot, has a big hole in the screen, which points to the big problems they were having with the color Vectrex, which is properly controlling those guns and stopping them from blowing the screen up.
Well, but this is the thing. This is not a 3-gun solution. What this news story is talking about is somehow in software they figured out how to do this.
They're saying without using an overlay, like an overlay on the screen. It is a 3-gun solution. That's the only way you can do color.
No,
vector.
This is the thing. They're talking about doing it as a software package for existing Vectrex machines. That's the story here.
This is the upgrade they're talking about. Because they also did a color Vectrex prototype that was actually...
No. This is supposed to be on existing Vectrexes. This is the Arcade Express newsletter May 1st, or the first one for May. There's 2 of them in May. That is supposed to be doing this. And here, I can pull it up real quick and read the news story to you. Because I don't know how they were supposed to be pulling this off either. Unless they were somehow messing with the beam in some way, or the frequency, or reducing the amount of time the beam was on so much that it would actually change what kind of image it would leave behind.
So I think so this makes sense. It was the intensity of the beam that I think was used in some degree to generate the color, and I think that's why they had the problem with it blowing a hole, because they were having to do weird things with the beam intensity.
Yeah, you would basically have to shorten it. Now, I saw one person online that had done some kind of modification, so suddenly the image would either be all red or all green, I believe, or blue. Now, I guess if you were really screwing with the timings right, you might be able to pull it off. But I can't imagine that would play nicely with the limited cycles that the CPU could produce.
Right. That's a good question. You're right. I don't have a full understanding of how this was going to work. But the spoiler alert.
Here it goes. Vectrex plans some more wizardry for this June's Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, where they'll show a 3D full-color game. They promise this miracle uses the existing hardware and the color doesn't come from an overlay. General Consumer Electronics is also working on a keyboard to turn the Vectrex. Yeah, we've heard about that nonsense before. But yeah, so they want to do color without the overlay. It's got to be the intensity of the beam, but I can't imagine
right
how to pull that off.
Well, and they in the end couldn't either, because it wasn't just. I mean, obviously, the system was a failure and it dragged Milton Bradley down with them, and that canceled all development. But they were already having problems making this work technically, even aside from the financial problems that they were having due to the crash. So.
Yeah. I mean, I saw an ad in one of the magazines this month where the Vectrex was going for, I think, just $10 more than a ColecoVision at this point. And considering that it's got a whole damn screen built into it, that's kind of scary.
Yeah, that's just not going to work. No, it is definitely a time when hardware is bleeding just as much as software, and that is, of course, why the Odyssey 3 is also dead.
Oh, you jumped over... Oh, no, No, you jumped over one.
Oh, you're right. I did jump over one. Sorry.
But we'll get to the Odyssey 3 being dead in just a moment. Spoilers. But yeah, let's do the other one first.
Sure. I don't have a transition now. Milton Bradley wants you to tell your Atari what to do.
Milton Bradley has announced a deal with Atari to bring their MBX technology, which allows voice commands to be given to a TI-99, to the 2600.
Yeah, they have this big voice thing. They're trying to get everyone to use it because they need to recoup some of the money on that.
And yeah, it's nonsense.
No.
The fun part is, and I did a little bit of research on this because I never used one of these before. Apparently what it's doing is not recognizing what you're saying, but it sort of records the sounds that you put in. So when you first use the device, you essentially have to give it commands, and it's like, when you're putting in the commands on an old joystick for the PC, where it's basically just emulating the keyboard or whatever, it's like up, up, down, down, and so forth. If you say down when it's trying to record the word for up, then the word down will always make you go up, because it's recorded that down is up until you reset it and recalibrate it with the proper words. Yeah.
Who says you can't change the laws of physics?
Exactly. So the TI-99 version did come out. The 2600 version will not.
No. And speaking of things that won't come out, he's back. Odyssey 3 is dead.
Oh yes, North American Philips has pulled the plug on their next generation console, the Odyssey 3. The device prototypes, which had been shown at trade shows, were apparently not going to be powerful enough to compete against the current crop of low-cost computers, especially as it would continue the Odyssey 2's tradition of including a keyboard and expand on it with a modem. NAP has decided to move forward with a full-blown computer that should be ready for release in 1984.
Narrator: it wouldn't be.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, of course, Odyssey in North American Philips was going to be the first one completely squeezed out of the market as it's all falling apart. There was nobody who was going to want an Odyssey 3 with VIC-20s, Commodore 64s, and ColecoVisions running around. Yeah.
And there's no way that they were ever going to be able to compete price-wise, especially with Jack doing what Jack does best.
Yeah, exactly.
The Odyssey name, which brought video games to homes, is going to be no more.
Yep.
Oh, interesting little side note. I didn't include it because there was no real story, but the People's Computer Corporation, am I getting that right? His newsletter from 1973.
People's Computer Company.
Yeah. People's Computer Company, thank you, yes. For those not in the know, it was a newsletter for computer enthusiasts back in the day. They actually had a photo of one of their clubhouse or meeting room or wherever where people could interact with computer technology, and they actually have these two kids playing on an Odyssey 2 in the magazine this month. So I thought that was kind of cool, but okay.
Meanwhile, however, while some companies are failing, some are still kind of managing to get by, including Activision, which prepares an IPO.
In early June, the world's first third-party console game maker will be going public, offering 4.5 million common shares at $15 to $17 each. Sales last fiscal year hit $157.6 million and could top $200 million in 1983, according to Christopher Kirby, an analyst at Sanford C. Bernstein & Co. in New York.
Same fellow who created our interesting market study on the industry that we talked about a few episodes back. Of course, how much profit are we going to get out of those $200 million in sales, Mr. Kirby?
Well, considering the number of cartridges that will not sell, and the fact that we've got to move into a little thing called the computer software market next year, where there's going to be a little thing called piracy, this may not add up.
Seriously, though, they do have their IPO, and this saves Activision. Activision would not have existed if it did not get through this IPO. And, I was curious about this. Of course, Magic, as we covered back in December 82, had to cancel their IPO. Of course, the timing was horrible because they were going to have it 2 days after Warner's new guidance on their fourth quarter earnings. So, you couldn't have it then. But, I was fascinated that they were able to get this out. And, I've interviewed Jim Levy, the CEO, and I asked him, in this climate, how did you have an IPO that anyone subscribed to? And he said, we were able to convince the market that we were a forward-looking consumer electronic entertainment company and not just a video game company. And I think it helped also that their years were like April to March years. I believe it's somewhere around there. Their fourth quarter was in the first quarter of the calendar year, which meant that they reported a great fiscal year in fiscal 1983 because it was almost all their great 1982 sales before the market completely collapsed. And I think that helped them too. They had a strong sheet because they hadn't had to report out on the catastrophic period yet.
Gotcha.
But this really saves the company because, spoiler alert, they lose money after they go public, they lose money for 16 straight quarters.
Wow.
But they were loaded with cash because they went public. So they basically just marked time burning cash for years until they could finally, sort of turn things around. And that's why we still have Activision today. If they had not gone through with this IPO, I am 1,000% positive that Activision would have just been gone, just like so many of the other companies.
Weird. Yeah, it's just weird. And I'm glad that they managed to pull this off. Given the atmosphere around this, it is kind of astonishing, especially because Activision hasn't released any computer software yet. If they had already been in the computer software business, I could have understood it. But at this point, they're only releasing 2600 games with maybe one port to the Intellivision at this point. It's weird.
Something like that. Yeah. 2 maybe. But yeah. And, I think they just did such a good job, according to what Jim Levy said, they just did such a good job of putting themselves out there as, by marketing the programmers and whatnot. They really put themselves out there as this very creative technological company. And I think they were just able to convince investors that they weren't another Me Too, that there was actually a lot of real creative talent there and that they would be able to make the pivot into new markets. And I think that's how they were able to do it. Combined with the fortuitous time periods that their fiscal quarters happened to be in, which meant that they got to report a lot of good news and hadn't yet had to report a lot of bad news. It's coming. But they haven't had to report a lot of bad news yet, like some of the other companies have.
Cool. And speaking of bad news.
Yeah, meanwhile, who needs He-Man when you have Thundar, who is coming to the ColecoVision?
The Ruby Spears post-apocalyptic cartoon about a Jack Kirby-designed barbarian is going to be coming to video games thanks to Xonox. Xonox. It's a weird name. A division of K-Tel, the people who sell records through TV ads. The game will be part of a line of double-sided carts that offer 2 games for the price of 1. I'm going to just call them Xonox.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah. Would end up releasing a handful of games this way for the 2600, as well as standalone games for the 2600, ColecoVision, VIC-20, and C64. Sadly, for whatever reason, the license was not applied in the end, and Thundar would be turned into Tomark the Barbarian. But the ColecoVision graphics clearly show the game's lineage, with backgrounds representing the ruined cityscapes of the show.
I vaguely remember Thundar reruns, but that was before my time. It was more late 70s, early 80s.
Very early 80s, yeah.
Yeah. He-Man buried that nonsense.
Well, I mean, yeah, Thundar had already run its course by that point. Never really got any toys, sadly. Right. But it had some very strong, considering standards of Saturday morning cartoons at the time, some very strong writing and some interesting plot lines and so forth as he travels around discovering the secrets of the lost world.
And he had a laser sword, which was all the rage with the kids at the time.
A laser sword and a giant animal, furry-looking companion who could only roar. And a princess along for the adventure in a flowy outfit. Yeah, I mean there were
a little bit of Conan, a little bit of Star Wars, a little bit of whatever. Yeah,
I mean the end scene of Planet of the Apes clearly also helping out. And, so it was a little bit of everything. It was Jack Kirby's typical, throw everything into the pot and see what comes out approach. But hey, if you want to talk about something that got buried because of He-Man, it was definitely Black Star. So, now.
Absolutely. But we're not here to... Oh.
Sorry.
But we're not here to talk about cartoons. We're here to talk about esports. Atari sponsors pro gaming event at Harvard.
Well, it's not pro gaming in the sense of professional gamers. It's pro gaming in the sense of it's not anti-gaming.
You see, I should read more than just the headlines and actually read the summaries. Atari sponsors pro gaming event at Harvard.
That's right. Atari has footed the $40,000 bill to organize a conference at Harvard to promote research done showing that video games are not harming kids. While they insist that the grant was merely to cover the administrative costs and all participants paid their own expenses to take part, the research presented was very one-sided. All apparently confirming that hand-eye coordination improved with the play of video games, that the time playing replaced time watching TV, and that in 40% of families questioned in one study, grades actually improved. The New York Times article covering the story does end on a bit of an awkward quote from Professor Greenfield, a specialist on children's language and cognitive skills, who, unlike most presenters, was not from California, but a Harvard grad, who said that one boy she spoke to told her that he preferred games to TV because, quote, on TV, if you want to make someone die, you can't.
Wow.
Yeah, that closing line was just...
That's a mood right there.
Yeah, all I have to say is that was... Clearly, some journalists had this assignment. They had to write up about this event that was clearly just a publicity piece, and then they got their one little nugget that they could throw in at the end to just basically be like, yeah, let's get the real story here.
If they die in the game, they die for real.
Oh, yeah. So, now this is also coming in under the specter of most major publishers of children's books and children's entertainment are preparing to enter the educational computer software business. There's huge articles on that in a bunch of publications this month. So this whole idea of, the games are not bad or the games can be good is definitely in the air as more and more people are buying computers to prepare their kids for the future.
I do think it's funny, the one where they're like, yeah, I know these kids are all playing these video games, but at least they're watching less television.
Well, that's
it's like
thing.
Lesser of two evils argument, right?
Well, that's the thing. It's kind of like, you're not, it's a zero-sum game. They're going to spend a certain amount of time in front of a tube.
Right.
It's do you prefer them to be watching mindlessly, or do you want them to be interacting with it?
Mindlessly.
As someone who has a 3.5-year-old kid, I can honestly say that this is a question my wife and I have tried to answer multiple times now, is, okay, if the kid is going to be in front of the screen, do we want it to be interactive or not? And to be honest with you, I have no idea what the right answer is at this point. It's, do we want her listening and singing along to a song about, what starts with what letter? Or do we want her, trying to mix and match things? I don't know which one is better use of the wasted time in front of the screen. I have no idea.
Have you asked her if she's ever frustrated with the fact that she can't kill the people on the TV?
Oh, I'm sure she is. I haven't asked her specifically because the last thing I want to put in her head is the idea that she the other day, and this is me being totally a dad moment, the other day she told my wife and I with this big smile on her face that, both of us had to die so she can go and spend more time with her best friend. Now, I don't think she understands the concept of death yet, but the whole idea
right.
that, if we weren't there, which in her mind is, if we die, then she can go spend more time with her friend. It was like, she's saying it with these sparkly little eyes and this cute little face, and you're like, either that's the cutest thing in the world, or we're going to wake up with her with a knife in her hand and that smile one day. So
charming.
No, yes, it's being a parent is weird. Okay.
Well, I have nothing that can follow that up, so I'm just going to say the headline: Control Video readies launch of Game Line.
There you go. William F. von Meister, I still love that name, co-founder of The Source, has a new venture we have talked about before, Control Video Corporation, which has announced the launch in June of its new service, Game Line, which will allow Atari 2600 users to download games over telephone lines with the help of a $50 to $60 add-on, and then charge them $1 per hour to play games. He has signed up several game makers, but has yet to get Atari, Activision, or Coleco. But iMagic is one of the financial backers of the enterprise, which also plans to broadcast advertisements in the 20 to 40 second periods during which games load to give users previews of new games, news, and other information. You look skeptical, my friend. You don't think this will work?
Yeah, I'm guessing this venture may kind of fall apart a little bit.
Just a little bit. Now, it will provide the backbone for much greater things. I mean,
yes,
a little thing called America Online. is going to spring out of some vestige of this, but yeah. I mean, it's not a bad idea, I guess. I mean, it's better than what they've been doing with the Intellivision.
Mm-hmm.
But the 2600 is just too freaking old for this. I mean, what would an advertisement produced through a 2600 even look like?
Exactly. Or sound like.
Yeah. I mean, you might be able to do something along the lines of the ET loading screen.
Right.
But, yeah, I got nothing. It's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's just too little too late with the economic climate and with the technology and everything. I mean, we're going to see a lot of false starts before Xbox Live. A lot of false starts trying to bring some which do experience a small degree of success for a time. They're not all complete and utter failures, but none of which really provide the ultimate solution, until we really get to Xbox Live. The Department of Corrections, I'm not saying there weren't systems that didn't work occasionally. It's just, the technology's just not ready for it.
No, at least not on console. I mean,
that's what I mean.
Some more success on computers, but you're dealing with a lot more memory. You're dealing with a lot more powerful hardware not necessarily from a game playing standpoint, but storage mediums and all this other stuff.
Exactly. And speaking of computers, it's time we turned our attention there. And our first news story in this segment, Commodore abandons 16-bit chip project.
After 4 years of development, Commodore has apparently abandoned development of a new 16-bit processor and instead has licensed Zilog's Z8000. In a sign of the evolution of the industry, Commodore has not gotten a blanket right to make the chips, but can only use them in their own computers.
Yeah, Intel's killed off second sourcing by this point. But this is one of the real failures of Commodore, really. Not that anyone realized it at the time, but so much of their early success was driven by the fact that they made their own chips at MOS Technology. And Jack never really understood that part of the business, and slowly over time, all of the really hot chip designers kind of fell away, and they never really hired anyone that was able to replace them, and so their chip operation just fell apart for lack of investment in it, and they couldn't keep up in a world of Intels and Motorola's and whatnot at that point. And that was really the beginning of the end of them functioning well as a computer company. Just abandoning this project.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about this when I interviewed Leonard Trammell. He talked very briefly about this because he wasn't really active at the company at this point.
Right.
But he did talk about how they had tried to get a 16-bit processor up and running. It never really worked. And I believe, if I'm remembering the timeline correctly, Chuck Peddle has already left MOS at this point.
Oh, yes. Yeah. He's gone.
And I mean, you're right. MOS Technology should have had a 16-bit follow-up to the 6502. I mean, the chip that ends up in the Super Nintendo a decade later, or 7 years later, that should have come from MOS. They should have kept that line going. It would have made a true follow-up, a backwards compatible follow-up to the C64 possible, which could have truly been a real game changer in the home computer market, in my opinion.
Yeah, but it would have kept them competitive, that's for sure. But Jack never really invested in that. I mean, he wanted them to be able to produce his own chips, but then he never really invested in the workforce that was needed to keep that innovation going.
Yeah. But then again, he's not going to be there for much longer anyway. So
okay, this is going to be a first here. We're going to have to tag team this one. I'll go first. You got application software in my operating system.
You got operating system in my application software. Oh, yeah, sorry. When I wrote that, I was like, how is this going to play? Oh, well. A clear trend is emerging in the application software business. The days of buying individual software programs for individual functions, such as word processing or spreadsheeting, are over. Instead, publishers are betting that you want all of these functions bundled together and integrated with your operating system for easier transfer of data between them. Apple's Lisa will come equipped with such software working in unison with the GUI operating system. VisiCorp's VisiOn promises to provide the GUI for PC compatibles, together with adapted versions of VisiCalc and Visi you name it. And Microsoft is launching MultiWord, a multi-plan compatible word processor that will ship with a mouse of their own that will cost $195 or $100 when bought together with the $375 MultiWord software package and only run on IBM's PC. Even relative newcomer Lotus with their 1-2-3 combo packages making sure they are present in these emerging systems. But are consumers ready for the hefty $10,000 to $12,000 price tag such systems will cost?
And the answer is no. Though, I mean, of course, this isn't targeted at the ordinary consumer. It's targeted at businesses.
Well,
but,
and here I did make a little bit of a mistake because the Microsoft bit with MultiWord actually comes from a separate article. So most of this comes from a Byte article, but the weekly Personal Computer News publication out of the UK has the Microsoft information.
Right.
And that came in fairly late in the game. So, I mean, Byte's always being written way, way early, and this was on the 20th of May that Microsoft is breaking this news. So the whole idea of $10,000 to $12,000 for these GUI systems is not going to apply to the Microsoft one because you don't need $10,000 to $12,000 for an IBM PC. I mean, yeah, you can probably talk about $5,000 for the PC plus another $475 for the program. And now you've got a mouse. Now you've got, it's still going to be text-based, basically ASCII character-based. But it's going to function like a GUI a little bit.
So what you're telling me is it's a far smarter business strategy to just skip the hardware part and just make an OS that everybody wants and then integrate your applications directly into the OS so that they run better on your OS than they do on anything else.
Yeah, that might be a strategy. And also
the Justice Department is going to love you.
Well, all I'm saying, and we talked about this in the last time jump episode when we went back to 1993, because, yeah, that was a topic there. But the idea that Microsoft is just like, oh, yeah, we're not doing this as a graphical user interface. We're just going to we're going to fake it with ASCII symbols, is actually, for this point in time, the much smarter solution. Mm-hmm. And now, as a side note, this is coming as Xerox, the company that pioneered this approach 2 years earlier with the Star system, has announced considerable losses in its Office Products division that sells the Star and 820 lines. So
yeah, these early GUI computers, which were of course targeted at businesses because who else could afford them, but they were even just too expensive for businesses, which is why the Star flops, the Lisa flops. Vision, it's not a computer, but Vision is a disaster for VisiCorp. It's the Microsofts and Lotuses of the world that are a little bit more conservative in the way they're doing their all-in-one bundling that end up being the clear winners here instead of these guys that are trying to shoot to the moon all at once.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter what it looks like. It matters what it can do. And that's where they're going to have that advantage. And yeah, on the Apple Lisa, I mean, it's just slow as molasses. It's just not the right machine for it. But then again, hey, 128K Mac isn't either, so it's all good.
But it's not all doom and gloom for Xerox, Carl, because at least Ethernet gets some endorsements.
That's right. The local area network standard built around Xerox's Ethernet technology has gotten a big boost by garnering endorsements from 13 companies including Intel, DEC, Fujitsu, Siemens, and Hewlett-Packard.
Man, Xerox is going to make so much money on this Ethernet stuff as long as they're not stupid and decide that it's not part of their core business and just kind of sell it off to the people who created it at the company. But they wouldn't do that, would they?
No, that would be dumb. That would be so dumb. Oh, wait a second. Yeah, they invited everybody in to take a look at Xerox PARC. I forgot.
Oh, Xerox.
Oh, Jesus Christ. They could have owned the world.
Yeah, it's unbelievable that they let Ethernet especially get away from them because that became a bit of a standard.
Yeah, and I mean, just alone, some of the patents that they could have controlled on Ethernet, and then each incremental speed increase could have been a new patent. They could have just kept milking that for 25 years at a time for forever.
Yep. And speaking of making critical mistakes to erode your position in the market by giving away the store to everybody else, CPM86 DOA.
While IBM let users choose which OS to install on their machines, the vast majority went with the cheaper PC-DOS, aka MS-DOS variant, over Digital Research's CPM86. Now, with a bevy of clones also choosing to go with Microsoft's product and Victor Technology, makers of the Sirius and Victor clone machines, also dropping the CPM variant, for Microsoft, the jig is up. It didn't help that Microsoft delayed ports of their basic compilers to the CPM86 operating system, and that an estimated 96% of 16-bit machines in the USA already run MS-DOS.
Oh, Digital Research.
Oh, yeah. It's so sad to see them fall this way. I mean, but yeah, it's talk about great brains, great development, and just losing that killer edge that if they had just pursued the business opportunities better, they probably Microsoft probably never would have had a chance.
Yep,
it's sad. Now, quick little side note on this, and I mean, because they're not completely dead yet. It's going to take a while for CPM to truly die. But at a recent National Computer Conference in Anaheim, a flood of 68,000 base Unix machines were shown, as if the granddaddy of all OSs could still hold the line against Bill Gates' juggernaut. So just as CPM is dying, Unix is back. And let's face it, CPM had more than a little bit of inspiration from Unix. And the 68,000 processor, it looks like that might be the new fight. Unix versus 68,000.
Yep, and the workstation market, which proves to be very fleeting.
Yeah. It's not going to go anywhere, but it is interesting that a lot of the publications this month, there's also a computer show in England where a similar phenomenon happens, and a lot of English companies, some of them are getting into the clone market, but other ones are still holding out hope that the 68,000 in Unix becomes the way to go for them.
Yeah.
And, it was.
But enough about the high end of the market. Time to go down low as Atari Computer Division goes big on advertising.
Atari plans to increase its advertising for the home computer division by 50% in 1983, and the number of outlets selling its computers to 15,000. This is no doubt to keep the increasing number of low-cost home computers entering the market at bay. Of course, their machines, which are far more expensive than the competition, will have a hard time gaining market share.
Yeah, I mean, the division's just in the process of falling apart like everything else. The head of the division, John Cavalier, fully recognizes that getting costs under control and unifying their product line across the price spectrum is the only way that they can really survive, and he's never really given the opportunity to do that as the company keeps falling apart. Another one of those Atari presidents I've talked to.
Yeah, and I mean, the machines are so long in the tooth at this point.
Absolutely.
It's just, yeah.
Yep, that's good old Atari for you. And how can you compete when the VIC-20 breaks through the $100 floor?
Commodore's VIC-20 has now broken through the sub-$100 price point to just $90 at some northeastern retailers like Toys R Us. This, coupled with the $100 rebate on a C64 Commodore, is offering when you trade in any game console or computer, and you know the price war is on.
Yep. This is the real beginning of the end right here for everybody in the home computer market, including Commodore at the end of the day. They kind of when you take up all the oxygen, you end up suffocating yourself in the end too. Obviously, they have the great 1983, but then they start losing money in 1984. So, I mean,
yeah,
they just lay waste to the whole market for a variety of reasons that we've talked about from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting so hard now. The Timex 1000 has fallen to just $70. So the VIC is not the cheapest, but again, if you ever tried to use a Timex 1000 or a ZX81, yeah, it's not really a comparable system.
Well, I mean, the mistake people made is you have to use the Timex Sinclair 1000 for the purpose it was actually built for. By which, of course, I mean a doorstop.
I'm not going to argue at that point. But come on, you can still play the whole Monster Maze game. So that's kind of cool. We've done a 7-minute in heaven with that one. So it was fun. Now, Timex offered a $15 rebate until the end of April, bringing the price of the 1000 down to just $55 for a while.
How are those profit margins looking, Timex? How are those profit margins looking?
Yeah. Now, hey, some people got their start on that machine. I mean, American McGee. First machine,
this is, again, one of the things people don't realize. It was actually really successful in 1982. It sold like hundreds of thousands of units in 1982. But as soon as computers that were far superior technologically to it got in the same neighborhood as its price, it was all over because there was no justification to pay just $10, $15, $20 less because the drop in the quality was so much that people at that point are just going to shell out the extra $20 and deal with it.
Exactly. Especially because, I mean, it doesn't have a graphics mode. It's just using characters. So as soon as you want to play games on it, as most people are wont to do, that becomes a problem. But this is the price war in the United States. Price war hasn't broken out in England yet, right? There's no price war in Europe yet.
I think there might be one starting up right about now, because I am told that the Sinclair line gets a price cut.
In the UK, the price cutting has begun in earnest, as W.H. Smith has dropped the price of the 16K Spectrum by £25 to just $99.95, and the 48K version will go from $175 to just £130. W.H. Smith also already carries computers in 245 of its shops and plans to expand that in 1983. This is coming as the Mattel Aquarius should launch in July in the UK at £110, and ads for the VIC-20 have it around £120 and dropping. Oric has also cut their 16K machine to just £99.
It's kind of fun. It's like Oric also has a computer, but yeah. I mean, this is, Sinclair is not in most ways the Jack Tramiel of Britain, because their approach to electronics is actually very, very different. But just in terms of leading on price and delivering something vaguely resembling power for price, Sinclair is able to take the market in the UK in a very similar way to how Commodore has taken the market in the United States.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, the 48K Spectrum, his high-end machine, is considerably cheaper. I mean, the ads this month in the UK are still showing Commodore 64 going for like $350 or something. And so it is still a relatively expensive, but we've talked about how Commodore has put shipments of the C64 to Europe on the back burner. In comparison, just because they are trying to fill those orders and take the U.S. market first. I mean, it will drop in price over there as well. And yes. Talking about the U.S., the Timex has delayed the May launch of the U.S. version of the Spectrum, the Timex Sinclair 2000. So it was supposed to hit the market in May. They've delayed it. They're doing their redesign, which is going to end up screwing up software compatibility and making the thing even less useful. So,
yep. Though, I've noticed something here. We just had this headline, and I see Sinclair here. That makes sense. I see Commodore here. I see Mattel. I even see Oric here. But where are our good friends at Acorn Electronics, Carl? I don't see them in this headline. Could it be that the Electron was delayed again?
Oh, that's right. Acorn's budget 32K machine, the Electron, which already missed Christmas, has now been pushed back to August and won't be available in large quantities until October. The estimated price is still set at £170.
Yeah, these delays killed it. If it had made its window, it might have had a fighting chance. I mean, I'm not saying it would have suddenly become a big thing, but even by the time it missed Christmas, it had basically already missed its chance in the market with all of the other computers falling in price so rapidly. And definitely by delaying again, any residual excitement that was still there for the Electron was almost completely gone by the time it finally appeared.
Yeah, I mean, the Electron has so many problems, including its lack of compatibility with the BBC Micro, and once it does finally hit, it's just going to look so outdated and primitive, and the C64 is just going to kick its ass as far as proper color computer with a real keyboard is concerned. It's not going to have enough memory to compete against the 48K Spectrum. And this is important to note that according to the UK publications, virtually everybody who's bought a Spectrum has bought a 48K version. The 16K versions are not really a factor. It's more or less an issue. You have to have one on the shelf just to show that it is available at a low price.
Right.
And yeah, this is going to be one of Acorn's biggest fumbles. You can argue about the success of the Archimedes later, but if you've watched the movie
Microman,
yes, that scene where he's just standing there in the warehouse,
I was thinking of that,
full of the unsold Electrons. Yeah, that's what's coming down the pipeline.
I love that movie. That is, I mean, it's not a perfect movie, but it is probably the best fictionalization of a topic in personal computer history so far. It's fun.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the only thing that even for my money comes close, and I know there's a lot of stuff they changed about it, Pirates of Silicon Valley is the other one that I love going back to it. I know there's a lot of problems with it, but yeah. I just buy into that version of Bill Gates at that age. I really do. I just buy into him so much. Okay.
Fair enough. But time to move back across the pond again as Spectra announces SV328.
With Spectra Video's first home computer, the SV318, just beginning to get some retail penetration, the company has announced the SV328, a 64K upgrade to their previous machine. Yeah, we've talked about the SV318 a couple months ago. The SV328 is going to be basically the blueprint for the MSX computer. And yeah, but the fact, I mean, it's total Osborne effect here, I think, because they haven't even really made it to mass retail yet, and they're already announcing that there's going to be a better, improved version coming down the pipeline. It's I don't know. Maybe they just noticed that the 318 really didn't stand a chance in the market.
Yeah. And then I guess we've snuck one final story in at the end here, the kind of story that me in the United States just doesn't care about at all, but I assume must have been very near and dear to your heart, as these last-minute sneak-in stories usually are. Commodore introduces the new form C2N.
That's right, and you are very, very correct in that regard. Commodore VIC-20 and C64 users can rejoice. The original external tape drive release for Commodore systems has been replaced with the iconic 1530 dataset. While functionally identical, the new unit is internally redesigned to be more reliable and will become a fixture for millions of gamers.
Imagine playing games on cassette. Pshaw, I say, pshaw!
Yeah, and now for those, since this is a audio medium, the original tape drive kind of looked like your typical Radio Shack tape drive, elongated, as wide as the tape was, deal. This is the design that has the counter on the right of the cassette tape, sort of this, it's nice and rounded corners, and it really will be like the iconic image, especially in the UK and a lot of South American countries where the disc drives were more expensive, and a lot of people did rely on the cassettes as a storage medium. And yeah, it's just a piece of that generation of gaming's. Yeah, it's iconic imagery, that tape deck. So
no, and I get that. I mean, obviously, I'm joking around a bit. I mean, of course, in America, we didn't use cassette drives. We moved to disc and stayed there. But I certainly recognize that for much of the rest of the world, that was the medium where they were first discovering games, playing games, mass pirating games, etc.
Oh yeah. Oh, I still remember when I was working in the computer store in Buenos Aires, because the data set had this tiny little metal screw on it that you had to go in with pliers unless you had a tool, and you could make slight adjustments, but there was always a little bit of setting that could go off on these things that wouldn't read the cassette just right. So people would actually bring in their data set when they wanted me to make game copies for them. And oh my lord, people bringing in their data set. I hated it. I mean, most people in Argentina were using disk drives by the late 80s. But you'd occasionally get a kid coming in, with the data set. And, they had enough money for like 10 games, and you're just like, please no, please no, please no. And they would just start rattling off games off the list that they wanted. You'd have to set it up and then put the disc in, copy it onto the thing for forever, put another disc in, copy it on it took forever. It's a huge pain in the ass.
I can imagine.
Yeah. Oh, well.
Yep.
The good old days.
So, moving right along to retail, profit margins on computers cause retailer consternation.
The price war in the home computer market is beginning to cause trepidation among smaller retailers. Especially toy retailers who saw video games become a major driver of their businesses are finding the tight profit margins afforded by computers to be a tough pill to swallow. According to Stan Strick, chairman of the board of Merchants West, which operates 19, I love the name of this place, Carl's Toy and Hobby Shops in California, quote, when you're paying 5% of your net profit to the mall owner, there is little chance for making money in a category such as this, end quote. And another quote of his, a hot price on a Commodore 64 out here might be about $369 retail. If the cost to me is $360, I'll make $9 selling one on a good day before overhead, end quote. A small specialty chain, Electronics Boutique, on the other hand, sees a future through limited selection and controlled growth. Bruce Nager, I think that's how you pronounce it, VP of the chain, says, we are carrying only that hardware we can make a profit with. These include the Texas Instruments 994A and ColecoVision. We think Coleco is the video game company of today. It has allowed the retailer to make a profit and a return on investment.
Yeah, another just fascinating look into the retail market that we don't get enough of. This stuff fascinates me as well as you. And first, it's fun to have a shout out to the small specialty chain Electronics Boutique. Right here at the beginning. And it was small then; it was at the beginning of its life. But
yeah, and the fun part
how
is
huge they got.
The logo that they would still have going into the 90s, that those rounded letters that were connected by lines, is already there in the stores.
Yeah.
I found that just absolutely fascinating. But yeah, it was a small specialty chain. That's how they described it. I was like, I have to include this. And then came this great quote from him, and I was like, okay, yeah, that's all good.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it just goes to show, and it also just goes to show how kind of weird a market this was for toy stores to be in. I mean, toy stores were used to being in a low margin business, but they were used to being in a low margin business where, you were selling $2 toys and taking, 20 cents off of them or whatever. It's kind of scary for them to still be in a low margin business with computers when they're having to when the cost is so huge on these things. That's a very uncomfortable place for toy stores to be in.
Well, especially considering that if you bet wrong and one of these companies disappears, you're not going to be able to return that product. It's going to be, most of them are going to get out. Toys R Us, as we will see, is still huge in that market. But it's going to be something exclusively for the big boys. And I know I've talked about it before, but I still do think, just from the numbers, the rise in the action figure thing is going to give them the out that they need to be able to exit this market without being worried about losing that gain. Yeah. Even though the toy trade magazines like Toys, Hobbies, and Crafts, the editorials keep trying to convince them that they need to be in this market. It's very weird to read those because it's supposed to be for the retailers, but they're like, no, we can't miss this opportunity. We have to get into computers. And I don't know where that motivation is coming from, but yeah, it really is the wrong impetus for them at this point.
Yep, absolutely. And speaking of strange retail outlets, for the computer market, book retailers eye software.
While sales of computer-related books have been growing for years at bookstores throughout the world, the idea of selling the accompanying software has not yet broken through, though. Just like with toy retailers, bookstores don't seem to know what to do with the product, how to fit it into the existing merchandise strategy, and the heavy price much of the software fetches, despite much higher margins, makes it harder to move.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole fad that starts up here, and it stems, I mean, obviously there's the computer book sale synergy thing, but this also stems from the fact that text adventures in the early days are such a big part that there starts to become an attempt to create a symbiotic relationship between the book industry and the computer software industry, is epitomized by the bookware movement, where publishers like Simon & Schuster were establishing computer game divisions and trying to sell text adventures and making bookstores one of their outlets. And it's a strange kind of odd couple match that kind of sort of lurches along and almost works for a couple of years, but ends up being a complete flash in the pan because they don't know what to do with it.
Of course. And I mean, it also goes against what most of the people walking into a bookstore are thinking about. Most of the books are relatively cheap. You know, they're impulse, I don't want to say impulse buys, but a lot of people go into a bookstore to, you know, pick up a copy of a book that they're going to read over the weekend or something.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's not the same. And they want to have a demonstration unit to see what the software looks like and stuff. That just completely changes the setup of the store, changes, you know, their calculations of how much are they making per square foot. It's a huge mess.
Absolutely. And speaking of huge messes in retail, software piracy becomes Return's problem.
What appears to be an increasingly universal problem for software retailers is attempts by customers to return software after they have either copied it or tried to copy it. Apparently, youngsters are spending a lot of time copying and trading computer entertainment software amongst each other. Who would have thought?
Oh, those lovable scamps.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's no way to completely figure out what the true impact of piracy was. You know, some people say it's overblown, that the publishers cried about it too much, but there definitely was an effect. And so it's interesting to see that effect kind of discussed at the retail level where it's not usually talked about. It's usually talked about at the developer or publisher level. But the way they're having to absorb these bogus returns.
Well, and that's the thing. It's a lot of the retailers are talking about how they are putting in these policies for software that either we don't take it back or you can only exchange software for another copy of the same program.
Right.
I mean, this is really something that they have to work out a deal. And yeah, I agree with you. It's hard to tell how big of a problem piracy is. But I think that if you compared the, you know, number of software titles sold per installed machine between home computers of this era and consoles of this era, that's when you really see the effect of piracy. I mean, how many copies of Pitfall did Activision sell for the C64 as opposed to, or per C64 installed as they did for the 2600?
Exactly.
That's when you suddenly realize, oh, it's a small fraction. Now, how many people played Pitfall on the C64 as opposed to the 2600? That's a whole different ballgame.
And yeah, you know, just recently, at the time of this recording, in my own podcast, we'd recorded on They Create Worlds a Will Wright focused podcast, and you know, the interesting thing there with his first game, Raid on Bungling Bay, it sold somewhere between 20 to 30,000 units on computer platforms in the United States, and then it was licensed for release on the family computer in Japan, and sold 750,000 units on the family computer in Japan. And I don't think the majority of that order of magnitude different in sales came down to different tastes in different cultures and different markets.
Yeah, no, a Raid over Bungling Bay, as someone who has played that game but never actually seen the package, I can tell you that, this is the computer software business, especially for low-end machines. And this is something we've talked about a lot in the 30-year jump, where the European creators of software, the people at Sensible Software and Ocean and so forth, they're going to miss the reason. A large part of the reason why the UK market fails the way that it does is that they keep trying to design games that will also run on low-end machines, thinking that having a larger user base is going to increase sales, whereas the US market through Origin and Microprose and so forth just realizes, screw the low end is just going to pirate it, but if you go with the guys who are spending $2,000, $3,000 on their computers, they will buy the software. And only target them, and you will get all the sales that you're going to get.
Yeah.
And
that was the smarter call.
It was the smarter call. We had this, like, I think 4 or 5 months ago in the 30-year jump where there was a game show in the UK, and they had these little snippets of interviews with the different developers, and it's Wild Bill Steely, like, no, we develop for the top end because everybody else isn't going to buy it. And that was directly opposed to, I can't remember who from Sensible Software, but they were like, no, you got to make it for everybody. And it's sad because there's a lot of talent that basically gets kicked out of the market at that point for that very reason.
Absolutely.
But oh well.
No, absolutely. I don't have a good transition for this. Sometimes it happens. So we'll just say it. Toys R Us controls 11% of toy market.
The traditionally fractured toy retail landscape in North America is quickly becoming dominated by a handful of big players, and no single player is bigger than Toys R Us, that has announced that they now control a whopping 11% of the toy retailing market, 18% of which comes from electronics.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't studied this in a systematic enough way to know that it's true, but I'm pretty sure that in large part, the rise of Toys R Us was fueled by the video game industry, because those of us who grew up a little later in the NES period or the Genesis period or the PlayStation period or whatever, used to the idea of video games being in toy stores. But as we talked about in our Crash episode from this period, they weren't really in that many toy stores in this time period, because a lot of toy stores were still very mom and pop. They're very low margin, which means they don't have the capital to necessarily take the risk on the big products. But Toys R Us, which was already building itself into a giant even before the video games arrived, they had the financial wherewithal to take that kind of risk on video games, and they won big by betting on video games, which allowed them to become an even more dominant force, because they could get into this high-margin video game business while a lot of their competition in toys was still stuck in the low-margin traditional toy business. And this is, of course, why Toys R Us continues to be a champion for video games through this entire period. Even in the dark days of 1984 and 1985, they're the one retailer of note that continues to bang the drum for video games and try to tell everyone video games are still a great idea, because I think it was so integral to their success. And, of course, becomes integral to their success again when video games, or their even greater increasing success when video games come around again with the NES.
Oh, definitely. And I still remember the Toys R Us's that I used to go to in and around Seattle. I remember vividly as the video game sections kept growing.
Mm-hmm.
Bigger and bigger. I remember around this period of time when, the video games were on this slightly higher podium where you would pull the little tags off of the display case and walk it over there, and they had a whole bunch of people, staff working back there pulling the games out of, these cages. And it was just this very, very weird experience. And then as the years went by, obviously it became home computers, and they'd have the Atari 8-bit and the Commodore 64 stuff and so on and so forth. They never really lost that. It was always present in the store. They always made sure that it was a vital portion of the store. And you're right. I can very much imagine that that's what's driving their big boost, even as now obviously the whole action figure thing is going to take off and become a major driver as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And skipping ahead, in the early 90s and whatnot, I mean, after that crash had happened, a lot of the specialty electronics retailers didn't come back to video games afterwards. Like, your Babbages and your electronics boutiques and your Best Buys and whatnot, they were selling computer games. They weren't really selling video games. And so, even after I had long outgrown all of Toys R Us's other products, for several years in the 90s, I would still have to return to Toys R Us to get my biggest and best selection of video games until finally our Best Buy was expanded into one of their early, what at the time they called superstores. Now it's just a normal Best Buy. But around the time the N64 came out in 1996 is when the local Best Buy expanded, and at that point finally started carrying video games. And so then I could finally do my one-stop shopping for all of my computer games and all of my video games at Best Buy. But for a long time, I still had to do Toys R Us if I wanted to get a good selection of console games, even in the early and mid-90s.
Yeah, and I mean, it really was a question of where else are you going to go to get these games, and any smaller store is not going to be able to afford to keep that level of inventory on
Exactly.
site.
Yeah, because you could go to a KB toy store and, get Legend of Zelda or Mike Tyson's Punch-Out or whatever in the 80s, but if you wanted a more obscure release, the KB is only going to have a very small number of video games behind the counter because, of course, they have to keep them behind the counter because they're high-priced items, and you don't have the shoplifting security systems yet that we have these days.
Oh, so you had to go to Toys R Us to get your Fester's Quest hit.
Right.
Yeah. That was
exactly.
worth the trip.
And obviously that we're getting ahead of the game here, so to speak, but I mean this is what they're doing in this time period too, is they're entering this high margin business at a time when a lot of toy stores aren't, and they're really reaping the rewards.
Oh, definitely. And before any of the big software chains have really spread out. I mean, they're already in those suburbs where it's going to take another 7 to 8 years before you get a software etc. or something like that.
Absolutely. Well, moving on to a few computer game companies. We're almost there, people. We promise. Got a big news story next as the first EA games go on sale.
Trip Hawkins' revolutionary new model for game publishing has borne its first fruits with a launch lineup of 5 titles hitting the streets. Hard Hat Mac, Archon, The Light in the Dark, Mule, Worms, and Axis Assassin.
I'm glad that I didn't have to correct you. I was afraid I was going to have to correct you. You said the title right, because Worms is a very fun and cheeky artillery dueling game by the fine people at Team 17, whereas Electronic Arts released a game called Worms.
Exactly, and as a good Amiga user, I would never, ever confuse the two because, well, it's one of our last enduring claims to fame until, of course, we finally someday get a new Turrican game. So, although, that's actually a C64 thing, so, it's all good.
Yeah, I mean, Electronic Arts entering the market is a big milestone in the history of the industry. Their launch lineup is not entirely successful. Archon and Hard Hat Mac are both very big hits in the context of sales of the industry at the time. Obviously, Mule has a soft spot in the heart of many gamers at the time, though, so it's a classic in that sense, but didn't exactly light the sales charts on fire. And the other games were just kind of quickly forgotten, but it's still a big moment that they're finally getting their first games out there about a year after the company was founded.
Yeah, and we talked about the founding last year, and it is interesting because they're going to get these out just a few days before the summer CES, and I'll put a link to it, but Trip Hawkins has been posting a lot of his old notebooks from this period of time on his LinkedIn page, and it's fun to go back and check those out on a basically day-by-day basis. Now, we've mentioned it before, but it's worth repeating here that all of these games are being released for the Atari 8-bit systems, but already Computer Gaming World is noticing that all, or at least most of them, will also be coming to the Apple II and the C64. So they're coming out, and they won't be bothering with the VIC-20, and they've clearly got the Atari 8-bit systems as their target. And I've talked with Ethan on Department of Corrections about this before, which will show, for example, in a game like Mule, where it's really designed for 4 players.
Right.
But, yeah, I mean, that Atari 8-bit market's going to dry up fairly quickly as far as being a lead platform.
Right. But this is, it's what we talked about just a second ago. Tripp was one of the first people to recognize and do what you were talking about before, which is target the high end, target the platforms where you can have the best, most amazing experience and work from there. And when he was first planning things in 1982, that was still the Atari 8-bit platform. By the time they could get the games out in 1983, and Tripp himself has said this, if they had known, they would have targeted the Commodore 64. But at the time they started, he considered the Atari 8-bit the most advanced platform. Then they pivoted very quickly to the Commodore 64 because it was the most advanced platform that mattered. Then he pivoted very quickly to the Amiga because that was the most advanced platform that mattered. Then, oh shit, the Amiga has failed. Pivot, and went back to the Commodore 64, which, very quick pivot, which helped save their position. But he was always, up until the point that the Amiga failed him, trying to target what he considered to be the cutting-edge platform on the market at the time.
Yeah. And it makes perfect sense, given the timeline. And yeah, I mean, he's going to be a little bit late on PC. But for that, he is going to make the jump to the Genesis on time. And that's going to make a huge difference. But we're still 5 years away from that. So
absolutely. And speaking of some other new arrivals in the field, Virgin Games is looking for a few good programmers.
Oh yes, Virgin Games, the new entertainment software subsidiary of the Virgin Group, has an ad in this month's Computer and Video Games magazine out of the UK, soliciting submissions for games as well as advertising a limited number of open positions for freelance machine code programmers. So if you, quote, want to be rich and famous, end quote, send your software to them, and if they like it, they promise to use the marketing muscle of the Virgin Group to get your game out there.
Yeah, and we've talked about this with a couple of the other companies that have entered recently. I think we talked about it with Thor and EMI a few episodes back. But, the British market is still a small market, and it's still a bedroom coder kind of driven market, but the sales are starting to get big enough that established companies are now wanting to tap into this bedroom coder movement and try to profit off of this bedroom coder movement. And so, someone like Richard Branson deciding that computer games is worthy of his company's attention. I mean, he's not directly, he goes and gets Nick Alexander to actually, deal with it. But the fact that he would even cast his company's eyes in that direction just shows that there is something happening here in the United Kingdom with these computer games.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, I recently interviewed Martin Wheeler. He was one of these bedroom coders who, publishes through Virgin, stays on with Virgin for quite a while. And I'll put the link to that in the show notes. And he talks about those early days. It's basically shoestring budgets and whatnot, but Virgin really does get the ball rolling with a lot of UK-based licenses. They do some stuff from 2000 AD. And then, of course, later on, they're the ones who take the reins and get the Sega machines off into Europe. And that infrastructure that they've built for distribution is the reason why Sega basically trounces Nintendo in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
In a big, bad way.
Absolutely. And it's not just the British that are getting more and more into games. The Canucks are getting into games, too.
Oh, who isn't? Sydney Development Corporation, a Canadian software company founded by former IBM employee Tarney Williams, has been making application software since 1978, but is now going to head into computer games with two big licenses, the Johnny Hart Comics BC and Wizard of Id. The games will get released by Sierra Online in the US, although apparently Sydney would do the distributing in Canada, at least according to one of the box scans on Moby Games.
That's right. And Sydney Development Corporation, not a name that rings out today, but of course its founder, Tarney Williams, also invested in a tiny little two-man teenage operation called Distinctive Software when they came to him with their first game, Evolution, and that grew into the monstrosity that is EA Canada. So this is still an important moment for the foundation of the entire Canadian video game industry, even though Sydney itself has a successful few years and then kind of fades away.
Yeah, and Tarney Williams will then go to Distinctive, and then after that he will become, I believe, the head of EA Canada, which is what Distinctive is later on. So, yeah, big career. He leaves. Tarney Williams, I was reading up on him. Interesting guy. I mean, he's in computers, and he goes off and does some stuff in biotech, then he comes back to computers and goes back off to biotech. I mean, very interesting character.
Absolutely. And another little company that may not sound familiar at first blush, but has been so influential as well, also launches. Spectrum Games has been launched.
The back page of the April 22nd, 1983 issue of UK's Personal Computer News is what may be the first ad from a small mail-order startup out of Manchester called Spectrum Games. It is advertising 4 games for the ZX Spectrum and VIC-20 that are clear knockoffs of arcade hits, but it is a start for the company that will soon become Ocean Software.
That's right. They figured out pretty quickly that it was probably a bad idea to have a name that basically ties your recognition to a single platform in the market, which is why they quickly changed that name. But it's the same company, just under a different name. And from humble beginnings to one of Europe's largest publishers, before all of Europe's largest publishers that were, big fish in small ponds got gobbled up by the even bigger publishers in other parts of the world.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they were the biggest publisher in Europe for a short while, and then, of course, they get gobbled up. Did they get gobbled up by Infogrames or by Ubisoft?
That is correct. No, it's by Infogrames.
Yeah. And then, yeah.
Because the French had something in that period that the British did not have, a very active stock market interested in technology companies. It was kind of their version of the dot-com boom, which is why suddenly French companies like Infogrames, Ubisoft, and Titus Interactive started owning half the computer game industry all over the world.
Yeah. And at the same time in Germany, it was media company stocks. If you could sell anything if you were buying movie licenses. It was insane. But
very interesting.
Yeah. I worked at a company. I got to see the contracts. I know how Lord of the Rings was really financed.
Well, when everyone else is dead, you'll have to tell that story.
Oh, yeah. It's fun stuff. Okay.
And now, after all this talk, after all of this investment we've made in computers and computer games, we finally, Carl, have to ask ourselves the question, I got a home computer. Now what?
A New York Times article looks at the conundrum facing many purchasers of home computers, namely, what to do with them. Most of the machines seem to be used primarily, if not exclusively, for gameplay. Practical applications like letter writing or home finance are either too hard to do or require expensive add-ons like disk drives and printers, making the endeavor financially unfeasible or too time-consuming.
This is definitely a conundrum at this period of time. They've tried so many different things to convince you that you're going to do, like balance the checkbook and store your recipes, and the industry's having a hard time getting beyond just games at this point.
Yeah.
Will they get beyond that? That is a question for future episodes of The Time Machine, I do believe.
Oh, yes. We will see many, many good uses of the computer that are not strictly game-related by, what, mid-90s?
Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much what we talked about in our last 30-year jump. What's the purpose of having a graphics program on your computer until you have the internet to be able to show those images off, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but...
Well, and that is really all the news that's fit to print this month. But of course, since we are in the midst of this very dark, dark period in video game history, we do have to end our episode with a little bit of in memoriam. And today we will be wishing a rest in peace to the good folks at Data Age.
Data Age, makers of Journey Escape, the tie-in 2600 game to the 80s rock sensation, has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Some of their games, like Frankenstein's Monster, will still trickle out, but the company will be no more, and sadly, take the Mr. Bill game license with it.
Oh no!
Exactly. Now, it's interesting to do this because we talked about them a few months ago, how it was the first time that a company had purchased a license for a 2600 game and had then sold a license to the arcades. That was a new deal. And they had sold to Midway the rights to make a Journey arcade game. And just as Data Age is going under, we're getting news that Midway has actually sold the license to convert their arcade game, which is a different design from the existing 2600 game, back to a console, namely to Coleco for a ColecoVision version. So that license got recycled. I'd love to see the original contract that would allow them to do that, but okay. Obviously not obviously, but yeah, Journey never shows up on the ColecoVision, just as a spoiler alert.
Yeah, so many things don't appear because we are currently in the darkest timeline, but eventually we will get out of here and back to the glory days. And in fact, as we kind of mentioned earlier, there will be a couple of very special new entrants into the market joining us the very next time we do a 40-year time jump that may play a role in starting to turn this whole thing around.
Yes. We may have already hinted at that for any listeners still awake and with memory of what we talked about an hour ago. So, okay, before we can close out this mega episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, Alex, you have one more task as the co-host, and that is to tell us what is the word of the episode.
Yes, well, I think the word of the episode has to be the power.
The power.
It just has to be the power.
Yeah, it does. It does.
This whole episode is about transitions and changes in power dynamics and rises and falls, and plus it featured the power.
There you go. It's perfect. I shall now take this wise word and guru meditate on it. Okay, so Alex, where can people find your fine work?
As always, they can sidle on over to theycreateworlds.com, where they will find the podcast that me and my partner, Jeffrey Dahm, release twice a month, every month without fail. I've also got the book, theoretically working on the second one, haha. And that's also They Create Worlds, which people can find at major online retailers. And, like once every 5 or 6 months or so, I deign to write a short blog post at theycreateworlds.com too. But that is definitely not the main form of what's happening.
Excellent. And everybody else, remember all the links to the socials, Patreon, everything is in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you back here next time. Have fun.